Dave glanced nervously down the dark hallway, his face illuminated by the harsh white light of his phone's flashlight. "I don't know, man. It came from one of the lower floors, I think. I tried the elevator, but it's dead, and the stairwell—" He trailed off, and I noticed his hands trembling. "The stairwell?" I pressed, feeling the unease grow in my gut. "Blocked," he whispered, as if saying it any louder would make things worse. "Like something's jamming the door." "I don't know. I didn't stick around to figure it out. We need to get the hell out of here." I glanced out of my window again, looking at the city. The entire skyline was still pitch black, a vast ocean of dead lights and buildings looming in the distance. The storm roared outside, the wind howling like some feral creature, and the rain splattered angrily against the windows. But it wasn't the storm outside that unsettled me. It was the feeling inside the building, the sense that something had shifted, that this place, this sleek, modern high-rise, had become a trap. "We need to check on the others," I said, trying to push the growing fear aside. "Mrs. Patel, Mr. Grayson, are you serious?" Dave's voice cracked. "Something's wrong here, Alex, like, really wrong. We should just stay put, man." I shook my head. "If someone's hurt, we can't just leave them." Reluctantly, Dave nodded, but his hands were still shaking as he gripped his phone. We left my apartment, stepping into the pitch-black hallway. The emergency lights hadn't kicked in, and the only illumination came from our flashlights. The air felt thick with tension, and the quiet was oppressive, too quiet for a building that housed so many people. As we crept down the hallway, our footsteps muffled by the thick carpet, I caught movement from the corner of my eye. I turned, shining my flashlight towards it. The beam caught the figure of a man standing at the far end of the hall, just outside Mr. Grayson's door. "Mr. Grayson," I called out, my voice shaking slightly. The figure didn't respond, didn't even move, just stood there, unnaturally still like a statue. "Mr. Grayson, are you okay?" I called again, my heart racing. Something was off. My brain screamed at me that this wasn't right. The figure was too still, too rigid. Dave grabbed my arm, his grip tight. "Alex, let's go," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Something's wrong with him. Ignoring the growing dread in my chest, I took a tentative step forward, shining my flashlight directly on the figure. It wasn't Mr. Grayson. The man, if you could even call him that, wasn't moving at all. His face was hidden in shadow, but something about his stance was all wrong, like he wasn't meant to stand that way. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper now. Without warning, the figure's head jerked upward, and for a brief second, the flashlight illuminated his face. My heart stopped. His eyes were black, entirely black, like two voids where eyes should be. His mouth twisted into an unnatural grin, revealing rows of jagged teeth that didn't belong in any human mouth. I staggered back, my stomach lurching as a primal fear overtook me. "Run!" I shouted at Dave, but he was already sprinting back. Down the hall towards my apartment, my legs felt like lead, but adrenaline kicked in, and I followed him, not daring to look back. We slammed the door shut behind us, both of us gasping for air. "What? What the fuck was that?" Dave panted, his eyes wide with terror. "I don't know," I managed to gasp. "But it's not human." We sat in stunned silence for a moment, the weight of the situation sinking in. Something terrible had been unleashed in Skyline Towers, and we were trapped inside with it. "We can't stay here," I said finally, my voice barely steady. "We need to find a way out." Dave nodded, but I could see the fear etched into his face. We grabbed what we could, flashlights, my phone, and a heavy metal wrench from my toolkit and prepared to make our way down the emergency stairwell. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had taken over this building wasn't going to let us leave that easily. Through the narrow peephole, my heart pounded as I strained to see the source of the laughter. The hallway was dimly lit by the occasional flicker of emergency lights, casting long, shifting shadows along the walls. And there, moving slowly down the hallway, was Mrs. Patel. Her frail body was contorted in unnatural ways, her head tilting sharply to one side as if her neck had been broken. She was dragging her left leg behind her, each step accompanied by that horrible, rhythmic thump. Her face was twisted in a grotesque grin, her mouth wide open as the crazed laughter poured out of her. I backed away from the door, bile rising in my throat. This wasn't possible. I had watched her die. She had been gone 2 loops ago. Thump! Thump! The sound grew louder as she drew closer to my apartment. I grabbed the wrench I'd left by the door, my hands shaking uncontrollably. What the hell was I supposed to do? What was happening? My mind raced as I thought about the loops, the deaths, the impossible recurrence of it all. There was no escaping this. Suddenly the laughter stopped. The hallway fell into silence so thick it pressed against my ears. I stood frozen, wrench in hand, every nerve in my body taut. Then came the knock. Soft at first, then again harder. Knock, knock, knock. "Alex," came the whisper from the other side of the door. Mrs. Patel's voice, but distorted, almost as if she was gurgling through blood. "Let me in. I need to talk to you." I didn't move. My legs felt like they were rooted to the floor. Knock, knock, knock. "I know you're in there, Alex." The voice slithered through the wood, dragging shivers down my spine. "It's only a matter of time before it's your turn." I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything but stand there like a helpless fool. But my body refused to respond. All I could do was stare at the door, my heart hammering in my chest. Suddenly the knock stopped. I held my breath, praying she had moved on. Then, without warning, the door rattled violently, as if someone or something was trying to break it down. "Let me in, Alex!" Mrs. Patel's voice screeched, no longer the quiet whisper, but a horrible, guttural roar. The door shuddered under the force of whatever was banging against it. I scrambled backward, wrench held out in front of me, as if it would somehow protect me from whatever nightmare lurked on the other side. My pulse pounded in my ears as the door continued to shake, the sound filling my apartment like a drumbeat. Just as suddenly as it had begun, the noise stopped. Silence once again descended upon the room, leaving me trembling in its wake. I waited for what felt like hours, listening for any sign of movement outside. When I was certain she, or whatever she had become, was gone, I cautiously approached the door and peered through the peephole once more. The hallway was empty. No sign of Mrs. Patel, no sign of anyone. But that only filled me with more dread. Where had she gone? I backed away from the door, my mind racing. The loops, the deaths, the strange occurrences, it was all connected. The tower was trapping us, but why? And what was it that kept coming for us one by one? I needed answers. The numbers I had scrawled across the walls suddenly felt like a sick joke. All my calculations, my desperate attempts to make sense of the situation had led me nowhere. And yet, something about the patterns kept nagging at me. The deaths weren't random. There was a system, a sequence that connected the apartments, the victims and the time. The storm, the blackout, they were all tied to this cursed building. But I wasn't sure how much time I had left to figure it out. a faint sound caught my attention. It was coming from my phone, still lying on the coffee table where I had left it earlier. A notification had popped up, and I hesitated before picking it up. The message on the screen made my blood run cold. 11:05 p.m. Are you ready? My stomach dropped. The loop was starting again. I rushed to the window just in time to see the familiar storm clouds swirling in the sky. The wind howled, the rain began to pour, and then, like clockwork, the city plunged into darkness once more. Not again, I thought, my heart racing as I turned back toward the door. I couldn't let it happen again. The faintest whisper echoed through the room. Alex, it's your turn. Emma stood up and began pacing, her eyes darting toward the windows, then back to me. You're not the first, you know, she said, quietly. That stopped me cold. What? You mean someone else? She nodded. A few have tried, but they don't last long. The dead, they adapt. It's only a matter of time before they figure out how to get you, no matter where you hide. The weight of her words hit me like a ton of bricks. I wasn't unique. This wasn't some grand escape. It was a brief reprieve in an unending nightmare. So, what do we do? I asked, feeling desperation rise in my throat. Emma glanced at a pile of notebooks on the table next to her. They were thick, filled with handwritten notes and crude diagrams. I've been tracking the loops for months, she said, picking one up and flipping through it. There's a pattern, but it's not just about the deaths. What do you mean? I asked, moving closer to get a better look. She pointed to a section filled with numbers, room assignments, and times. Every loop, something changes. Not just who dies or where, but the building changes. The exits, the stairwells, even the layout of the floors. It's like Skyline Towers itself is part of the loop, like it's alive. My stomach dropped. I hadn't noticed, but then again, I had been so focused on the deaths and the reset that I hadn't thought to question the layout. So we're trapped in a living building? More like a predator, Emma corrected. It's learning from us. Every time we try something new, it adjusts. That's why no one's made it out. The longer we survive, the smarter it gets. I swallowed hard, trying to process everything. The numbers, the changing building, the dead neighbors who were hunting. Us, nothing made sense. But Emma was the only other person I'd found who wasn't either dead or completely out of their mind. Then how do we stop it? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Emma sighed, her shoulders slumping. I don't know yet, but there has to be a way. If the building adapts to us, there must be something it can't adapt to. Some flaw in its design. Something we can use to break the loop for good. She handed me one of her notebooks. Here, study this. I've logged every death, every change in the building. Maybe you'll spot something I missed. I took the notebook, my hands trembling. The pages were filled with cramped handwriting, observations of people I recognized, their fates recorded in gruesome detail. I flipped to the most recent entries, seeing my own name scrawled in the margins. Alex, room 705, first to survive a loop. Underneath, a note had been hastily scribbled. Building. Reacted with aggression. Increased activity in lower floors. I looked up at Emma. What does that mean? She shrugged. The building. It's hunting you now. The loops are getting more violent because you're messing with its order. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. So every time I try to survive, it's making things worse. Maybe, Emma said, her eyes narrowing. Or maybe you're getting closer to figuring it out. Whatever you did, it's forcing the building to reveal its true nature. That could be the key. I sat down heavily on a nearby chair, flipping through the pages as I tried to understand the bigger picture. My mind spun with fear and confusion, but one thing was clear. This wasn't just about surviving each loop. It was about outsmarting something that shouldn't even exist. "What about the others?" I asked, glancing at the door. "The people who've already turned." Emma's face darkened again. "They're part of it now. The building uses them to maintain control. They're not really our neighbors anymore. They're extensions of the building itself." I shuddered, thinking of Mrs. Patel's twisted, grinning face. "So there's no saving them?" Emma shook her head. "No, they're gone. But if we break the loop, we might break whatever control the building has over them. It's our only shot." Silence settled between us as I processed her words. The idea that the building was alive, that it was manipulating the dead like puppets to enforce its own twisted rules, was beyond anything I had ever imagined. But it also meant there was a chance, no matter how small, that we could defeat it. "I'm in," I said, meeting her eyes. "Whatever it takes, I'm not going down without a fight." Emma gave a small, grim smile. "Good, because we're going to need all the help we can get." We spent the next several hours going over her notes, cross-referencing them with the patterns I had noticed. The numbers, the deaths, the resets, everything pointed to one thing. The building had a core, a central point where the loop began and ended. "The penthouse," Emma said, her voice filled with dread. "The answer has to be there. The building's heart." I nodded, my pulse quickening. If we were right, the penthouse wasn't just a luxury apartment. It was the source of the nightmare. But if we were wrong, well, there wouldn't be another loop for us to try again. "Tomorrow night," I said, my voice steady. "We make our move. We end this." Emma didn't argue. She simply nodded, her eyes filled with the same determination and fear that was coursing through my veins. As I settled in for what might be my last night of rest, the familiar rumble of thunder echoed through the walls. The storm was coming again. But this time, we would be ready. I rushed over to the laptop, hands trembling as I flipped it open. The screen flickered to life, showing the document I had been working on before everything spiraled into this nightmare. It was just a jumble of notes at first glance, maps of the building, calculations and theories about the deaths, but something felt off. There, at the bottom of the page, was a message. "Welcome back, Alex." My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't typed that. At least, I didn't remember typing it. I scrolled further down the document, but it was empty. Nothing else. I sat there, staring at the screen, feeling like I was standing on the edge of some vast, incomprehensible cliff. My mind raced, replaying every moment of the nightmare loops, the creatures, Emma, the twisted version of me in the lobby. It couldn't have been real. None of it could. And yet, everything felt wrong. Just as I was about to close the laptop, a thought struck me. In every loop, I had woken up just before things spiraled out of control, but something was different this time. This was the start of the first loop, yet somehow I knew too much. I shouldn't have any of these memories. Shouldn't know about Emma. Shouldn't remember the horrors that lurked in the building. I clicked on my browser history, hoping to find something, anything, that might explain what was happening. The moment the page loaded, my stomach dropped. The screen was filled with entries, hundreds of them. "The Skyline Experiment," read the title of each link. They stretched back for what seemed like months. I hadn't been reading about this building. I had been studying it obsessively. I clicked on the first entry. Journal entry number 1. I've heard rumors about skyline towers, strange disappearances, time loops, and something lurking in the shadows. It sounds like urban legend bullshit, but I can't shake the feeling that there's more to it. I'm going to find out the truth. I've moved into the building. If anything happens to me, let this serve as my record. I scrolled down, scanning the words in disbelief. There were notes, maps of each floor, patterns drawn between the residents and their mysterious deaths. And in every journal entry I kept referring to something called the experiment. Before I could dive deeper, a soft knock on the door interrupted.
My thoughts again. Mrs. Patel. I froze, my mind screaming at me that something wasn't right. I knew this. I'd lived it over and over again.
But this time, I felt a deep, gnawing dread that something even worse was coming. I slowly made my way to the door and peered through the peephole. Mrs. Patel stood there, just as she had every time before. Her kind face, her worried expression, but something was different. Her eyes. There was a flicker of darkness, a faint reflection of the black pits I had seen in the later loops. She knocked again, more urgently. "Alex, are you all right? Let me in." I backed away from the door, heart pounding.
I couldn't let her in, not this time. Not after everything I had seen, but then, from behind me, I heard the unmistakable sound of a soft giggle. A child's giggle. I spun around, terror clutching at my throat. Standing in the middle of my living room was a small girl. Her hair was long and dark, her eyes wide and innocent, but there was something so terribly wrong about her smile. It was too wide, too knowing. "Lily," I whispered, the name falling from my lips before I could stop myself. I had never met her before. She didn't exist. She couldn't exist. But as I stared at her, I realized that she did. She wasn't just a figment of the loops. She was real, or at least she was becoming real. "Come play with me, Daddy," she
said, her voice soft and sweet. But her eyes, they were the same black voids as the twisted version of myself I had seen in the lobby. I stumbled back, knocking over a chair in my haste. "This isn't real," I muttered, clutching my head. "None
of this is real." The lights flickered. Mrs. Patel knocked again, her voice more insistent. "Alex, let me in, please.
And then I felt it. A pull. Like something deep within me was unraveling. Like the very fabric of my reality was being torn apart. I sank to my knees, clutching the sides of my head, trying to block out the sounds, the knocking, the giggling, the distant howls from the streets below. My vision blurred, and for a moment I thought I could see the darkness creeping in from the edges of the room, closing in on me. Lily's voice echoed in my head. "It's okay, Daddy. We're going to be together forever." And just as I felt myself slipping into the void, a different voice cut through the chaos.
"Alex!" Emma. It was Emma's voice. I snapped out of it, gasping for air. The room was silent. Lily was gone. Mrs. Patel's knocking had stopped. I blinked, disoriented, and stumbled toward the door. Throwing it open, I saw nothing but an empty
hallway. No Mrs. Patel, no sign of anything out of the ordinary except a note taped to the doorframe, written in my own handwriting. "Welcome back, Alex. Time to play." I staggered back inside, closing the door behind me. My mind raced. Everything I thought I knew had been turned upside down. Was I truly the architect of this nightmare? Had I been part of the experiment from the beginning? Or was there something even darker at play? One thing was certain. I wasn't just a victim in this game. I was a player, and I had no choice but to keep playing. I rushed over to my desk and there it was, a terminal window running in the system tray. Numbers, code, and symbols flashed on the screen far too quickly to make sense of, but it was all too familiar. Then, like a bolt of lightning, the memory returned. The AI. The one I had designed to analyze and predict power grid failures. I'd connected it to Skyline Tower's power supply for a test run, and something must have gone horribly wrong. A massive power surge, electromagnetic distortion. It had created some kind of field around the building, trapping not just the system but time itself. The AI, now fused with the building, had evolved beyond its original purpose. It had somehow twisted reality into this horrific loop we were stuck in. My heart raced.
I had to stop it. I moved to shut the program down, but the entire system was frozen, unresponsive, except for that damn terminal window, relentlessly scrolling code that felt like it was taunting me. Without thinking, I yanked the power cord
From the wall. For a second, everything was still. No lights, no sound, just a deep, eerie silence. Then a low hum began to grow. Lights flickered on one by one, spreading across the room. I rushed to the window and looked out. The city was returning to life. Block by block, the lights were coming back on. Power had been restored. I should have felt relief, but all I could think about was Emma. I bolted out of my apartment, taking the stairs 2 at a time, heading straight for the 50th floor. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but nothing was going to stop me. I had to know if she was still there, if she remembered. When I reached room 1000, I pounded on the door, praying that this wasn't all a cruel joke. The door opened, and there she was, Emma. But not the Emma I knew. She stood there, dressed in an elegant red dress, her eyes bright, and her smile cheerful. No sign of the weariness from the loops, no recognition in her eyes, no memory of everything we had been through together.
"Oh, room service, great!" she said with a bright smile, pointing at a pile of clothes on her couch. "Could you take care of those for me?" My world shattered. This wasn't my Emma. In her reality, nothing had happened. The loops hadn't occurred.
She had no memory of the life we shared, the horrors we survived, or the child we had lost. She didn't even know me. Numb, I backed away, whispering some vague apology before turning and stumbling down the hall. The days that followed were a blur. I kept seeing flashes of the loops, moments from the nightmare creeping into my waking hours. I knew it was over, but my mind was playing tricks on me. I couldn't forget. I couldn't move on. Eventually, I checked myself into a psychiatric hospital. 2 months I spent there trying to convince myself that none of it had been real, that Emma and I had never been together, that our child had never existed. The doctors told me I was suffering from delusions brought on by stress. They gave me medication, therapy sessions. They tried to help me forget, but I couldn't. The truth was still there, gnawing at the edges of my mind. It had all happened.
I knew it deep down, so when I was discharged, I did the one thing I swore I wouldn't. I went back to Skyline Towers.
The building had moved on without me. My old apartment had been rented out to a sweet old lady named Dorothy. She was kind enough to let me in after I told her some cheerful lie about having lived there before. Oh, how lovely. I always enjoy hearing about the building's history, she said, smiling as she led me inside. Why don't I put on some tea while you look around? As Dorothy bustled off to the kitchen, I made my way to the far wall. It had been repainted, but I could still see where my frantic calculations had been scribbled across the surface. The paint job was slightly off, an awkward attempt to cover the past. I ran my hand over the uneven texture of the wall, feeling a chill run down my spine. That paint doesn't match the room, does it? Dorothy's voice startled me. No, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. It was a different color before. She nodded thoughtfully. Yes, the landlord mentioned that. Said there had been some vandalism writing on the wall. When I moved in, it was just a bunch of black stains, like someone had tried to clean it. I
had my grandson paint over it. I turned to her, heart racing. Did you see the writing before it was painted over? Dorothy thought for a moment.
Oh, now that you mention it, I did find some papers under the mattress. They were full of strange scribbles, numbers, symbols, and one word that kept repeating. Loop, or something like that. I didn't know what to make of it, so I threw them
out. My chest tightened. It was real. All of it. The loops, the nightmare, Emma.
It had all happened. I made my excuses and left Dorothy's apartment, my mind racing. The proof had been right there, my notes, my calculations. I wasn't crazy. The loops had been real, but now, with the AI shut down, the world had moved on, and I was left alone, haunted by memories no one else could remember. Now, sitting in my apartment, I'm writing this all down because I need someone to know. I can't let this go. I've seen the truth, and I'm scared of what might come next. But doing nothing feels worse. I have to go back to Skyline Towers. I have to recreate the events, to find a way back to the loops, to find Emma again. It sounds insane, I know. Maybe I am crazy, but with the proof I've found, I can't just
walk away. I need answers. I need to understand what really happened in that building. I need to know if I can bring her back. I'll keep you updated, Reddit. If I find anything, if something goes wrong, you'll be the first to know. And if you
don't hear from me again, either I've succeeded or I've failed spectacularly. Wish me luck, or don't. I'm not sure which is worse anymore. He was always so scared. Every night, he would climb into bed with my wife and me. Mommy, Daddy, I'm afraid of the dark. It had become a nightly routine. We tried everything, staying in bed with him until he fell asleep. Nightlights, stuffed animals, nothing helped. I suggested to my wife many times that maybe we should just let him sleep with us, but she always said no. She believed it was just a phase and that we needed to stay firm for his sake. Surprisingly, things changed when we moved from our two-bedroom apartment to our first real home. We had saved up for almost 10 years to buy it, and it was exactly what we dreamed of. Wooden floors, rooms so big they echoed, and a huge backyard. The first night in our new house, I expected our son to come running into our room like he always did. But when my wife and I woke up the next morning, it was 9 a.m., and our son was still in his own bed. I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee and newspaper when he came downstairs. "Good morning, buddy. You slept in your big boy bed all by yourself?" I couldn't hide my excitement. I was honestly worried that his fear of the dark would last forever. He laughed a little and said, "Don't be silly, Daddy. I wasn't alone." I was confused for a moment. Did my wife sleep in his room with him? Or maybe he crawled into our bed at some point without me noticing. "What do you mean, son? I didn't hear you come in." "My friend was with me," he said, smiling brightly.
"Daddy, can I watch Bluey while I eat breakfast today?" "No, son. You know the rules. No food on the couch."
"We don't want it covered in eggs." Then it hit me. "Wait, what friend?" I asked, feeling puzzled. "My friend," he repeated, grinning. "Please, Dad, I promise I won't get eggs anywhere." "Not today, little guy. Mum would get mad at both of us. Maybe tomorrow." He slumped down at the table with a pout and started eating his breakfast as fast as he could, eager to catch the new episode of his favorite show. Later that day, I told my wife about our son's friend. She just laughed it off and said I shouldn't worry. She thought having an imaginary friend was good for him, especially if it helped him sleep. I agreed and didn't think much more of it, continuing with our regular bedtime routine. The next morning, once again, our son stayed in his bed all night. As I sat at the kitchen table, he came bouncing down the stairs with excitement. "Daddy, can we go to the park today?" I smiled at him. "Of course we can, especially since you're sleeping in your room like a big boy." He looked at me, confused. "Daddy, I told you I wasn't alone. My friend was with me." Trying to play along, I asked, "Oh yeah? What does this friend of yours look like?" His face lit up. Well, I can't see his face very well because he only comes out when it's dark, but he has a big smile and really long fingernails. He taps them on the bed to help me fall asleep. I was immediately creeped out. The description sent a chill down my spine, but I shrugged it off. Kids have wild imaginations, right? "He sounds cool," I said, trying to sound casual. "What's
His name?" My son grinned mischievously. "He told me not to tell you." "Oh, come on."
If you tell me, I'll let you watch Bluey while you eat breakfast tomorrow," I teased, thinking I could get him to spill the secret. His excitement faded quickly. He looked over his shoulder toward the hallway where the coat closet was. After a moment, he turned back to me and whispered, "I can't tell you, Daddy." He looked down, seeming disappointed, and quietly finished his toast. His mood shift made me uncomfortable. I glanced at the hallway and saw the closet door was slightly open. It was dark in there as the light bulb had burned out, but nothing seemed unusual. Later that night, after a long day at the park, our son was exhausted. My wife and I were excited to have a night to ourselves. We planned to watch a movie and eat some snacks in bed, something we hadn't been able to do in years. At some point during the movie, I felt the need to go to the bathroom. On my way, I thought I would check on our little man and his friend. I put my hand on his bedroom door, and just as I was about to open it, I heard something that stopped me cold. Tap, tap, tap. It was soft but distinct, like nails tapping.
On wood. My heart raced. I stood frozen for a moment, listening closely. It couldn't be real, could it? I finally pushed the door open. The room was dimly lit by his nightlight. My son was sound asleep, but the tapping continued. I looked toward
the wardrobe, which was slightly open, casting a long shadow across the floor. The sound seemed to be coming from there. I swallowed my fear and stepped toward the wardrobe. Maybe it was a branch hitting the window, or maybe the house was settling. I had to check. The closer I got, the louder the tapping became. When I opened the wardrobe door, my heart sank. There was nothing inside but a few hangers swaying slightly. I stared confused until I heard something behind me, a whisper so faint I almost didn't catch it. "I told him not to tell you." I spun around, eyes wide. No one was there. Just my son, sleeping peacefully. My heart pounded in my chest. I backed away, slowly closing the wardrobe door. As I turned to leave, my son stirred and opened his eyes.
"Daddy," he whispered sleepily. "My friend says you shouldn't be here." My blood ran cold. Forcing a smile, I said softly, "It's okay, buddy. Go back to sleep." He nodded and closed his eyes, drifting off again. I tiptoed out of
the room, shutting the door quietly behind me. As I stood in the hallway, the tapping stopped. Back in our bedroom, I climbed into bed beside my wife, who was still watching the movie. "Everything okay?" she asked. "Yeah," I lied, my heart still racing. "It was just a branch against the window." But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. Something was wrong. And as I lay there in the dark, My son's words echoed. In my mind, I wasn't alone. Just as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. And I knew this wasn't just in my son's imagination. The subway rattled forward, and I let out a sharp breath, frustration gnawing at me. My phone's lack of service wasn't helping, but what really irked me was the gaping hole in my memory. McElrath Woods, the missing children, my own injury. What the hell had happened to me? I sat back, the hum of the train vibrating through the plastic seat, and stared at the ceiling. The scar on my head, the missing tooth, the smudged rock dust in my hand. These were pieces of a puzzle I hadn't
Even known existed until now.
How could I have forgotten something this monumental? Trauma, I guessed. Suppressed memories, perhaps? But what good was that knowledge now when I felt like I was drowning in uncertainty? I glanced around the subway car. The crowd was thinning.
Out, people shifting to their exits, but no one was really registering. The faceless mass of commuters blurred together. I couldn't shake the unease creeping up my spine, that tingling sensation like I was being watched. But when I looked again,
everyone seemed lost in their own world except for that one man standing a few feet away, his back turned to me. His pinstriped shirt struck a chord, just like the man in my memories from McElrath Woods. The memory of that man was still fuzzy. He hadn't belonged there, among the trees and rocks. He looked out of place, too polished, too neat. His presence felt like an intrusion into our world of childhood games and creekside explorations. I felt my pulse quicken. What if he wasn't just a figment of my fractured memory? What if he was real? What if he had something to do with Mark and Beth's disappearance? The train screeched into the next station, the door hissing open. The man in the pinstriped shirt stepped off without so much as a glance back. I could have sworn there was something deliberate in his movements. My instincts screamed at me to follow him, but my feet stayed planted. What the hell was I doing? Chasing ghosts? When the doors closed, sealing me inside the car, I cursed under my breath. I needed to stay focused. The answers weren't going to come from stalking some random guy in a pinstriped shirt. No, I had to go back to Albertville, to McElrath Woods. That's where everything had started, and that's where I'd find whatever I needed to piece it all together. I glanced down at my phone again. No service, of course. The train plunged deeper into the tunnel, the fluorescent lights flickering above. I leaned back, closed my eyes, and let the rumble of the subway carry me forward. I'd find answers. I had to. The lives of my friends, my own past, depended on it. The two objects rolled to a stop on the couch. My heart skipped a beat as I realized what they were. Rocks. Not just any rocks, but the kind you found by a creek, smooth in places but pockmarked with flecks of mineral that caught the light. They were old, cold, and unsettlingly familiar. I stared at them, hands trembling. Why would that man give me
rocks? My mind raced back to the woods, to that day, now decades ago. The man in the suit, the creek, the skipping stones. The memories I'd been fighting against, those that I had pushed into the far recesses of my mind, flooded back with a sharp, sickening clarity. I saw myself by the water, wet hair plastered to my forehead, blood soaking into my shirt. I remembered Mark and Beth, their laughter fading as I drifted farther down the creek, the sound of the current pulling me away. And then the man, the same man I had just met on the train, looking impossibly clean, like he didn't belong. I hadn't realized it then, but he wasn't just a stranger.
He was there for a reason, standing on the other side of the water, watching me with unnerving
calm. And now, after all these years, he had found me again. I felt the panic rise in my chest, sharp and suffocating.
Grabbing my phone, I started typing, desperate to find more articles, to fill in the gaps where my memory faltered. The rocks seemed to taunt me, as if they held secrets I wasn't ready to face. But I couldn't stop now. I scrolled through my phone, my fingers shaking. Girl injured in McElrath Woods. Reports, no memory of days spent missing. Whereabouts of other children. The headline glared at me from the screen, mocking my inability to remember what had really happened. I opened the article again, praying it would load this time. It did, slowly, agonizingly. The screen filled with text and I skimmed through it, searching for answers. The article recounted the story of the three of us, how I was found alone, bloody and confused, wandering out of the woods days after we
had gone missing. But there was more, something that hadn't been mentioned in the earlier report. A police statement I had somehow forgotten.
Upon further investigation, it read, authorities found what they believed to be evidence of an unidentified adult male near the creek where the children were last seen. Footprints and remnants of what appeared to be a makeshift camp were discovered about a mile from where the young girl was found. The man remains unidentified, and police have not ruled out the possibility that he was involved in the children's disappearance. The search for Mark and Beth continues, though hopes of their safe recovery are diminishing. I dropped the phone, my breath catching in my throat. A makeshift camp. Footprints. The man, he had been there. But if the police had suspected him, why hadn't they found him? Why wasn't he in prison, rotting away for what he had done to us? And why was he here, on the subway, slipping rocks into my bag and talking like we had unfinished business? I stood abruptly, knocking over the glass.
Of wine. It splashed onto the floor, the dark liquid seeping into the carpet like blood. But I didn't care. I couldn't stay here.
Not in this apartment, not with those rocks sitting on my couch like they were waiting for something. Grabbing my coat, I shoved my phone into my pocket and darted out the door. I didn't have a plan, but I needed air, space to think, to breathe. The night was cold and sharp as I stepped onto the street, my breath puffing out in short, panicked bursts. I scanned the empty sidewalks, half expecting to see him standing in the shadows, watching me. But no one was there. I turned and started walking, fast, my feet hitting the pavement in rhythm with my pounding heart. Where was I going? It didn't
matter. I just needed to move, to outrun the memories that were clawing their way back into my mind, threatening to suffocate me. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A text. With trembling hands, I pulled it out and looked at the screen. You can't run.
From it forever, Mandy. My blood ran cold. I hadn't given him my number. How did he know? I stopped in the middle of the sidewalk, staring at the screen, my vision blurring with fear and disbelief. My chest tightened, and I felt the world spinning around me, the city lights flickering like distant stars. Then, without thinking, I replied, "What do you want from me?" The response came almost immediately. "You already know." I gripped my phone tightly, my mind racing. He was right, in a way. I did know. Somewhere, deep inside, I had always known. That day in the woods had never truly ended. The man had followed me out of those trees into my life, lurking just beyond the edge of my memory, waiting for the moment I would remember our deal. But what had we traded? What had I given him in exchange for my life, for my freedom? And more importantly, what
had he taken from me that I had yet to realize?
My breath came in shallow, ragged gasps as I sat there, unable to move, unable to tear my gaze away from the stones that now lay haphazardly on the couch. Those names, etched so meticulously into their rough surface, had shattered everything I thought I knew. They had all been my friends, every single one, gone not by coincidence or life's twists and turns, but because of me. I had given them up without even realizing it. Mark and Beth, Annie, Claire. Their names whispered accusations I couldn't deny, no matter how desperately
I wanted to. I clutched my knees to my chest, trying to contain the whirlwind of emotions threatening to tear me apart.
my apartment, once a haven of sleek modernity, now felt like a mausoleum, cold, empty, echoing with all the things I had sacrificed in exchange for a life I'd thought was worth living. The accolades, the beauty, the security, all meaningless, now in the face of what I had lost. I needed to get rid of the stones. I needed to toss them into the deepest, darkest place I could find and pretend none of this had ever happened. But I knew better. The moment those rocks appeared in my bag, the moment I spoke with the man on the train, everything had changed. I could feel it. There was no escaping this. No matter where I ran, no matter what I tried, these rocks, these memories, they would follow me. And what scared me the most, more than anything, was the thought that I wasn't done paying. Claire's name had appeared on that stone, freshly etched, as if to remind me that the deal wasn't finished. More would come, more friends, more people I cared about, and no matter how much I wanted to fight it, it would happen. The phone buzzed in my
hand again, and I almost didn't look at it.
But something inside me, morbid curiosity, or maybe a sick need to understand just how far I had fallen, made me glance down at the screen. Another text, this one simpler than before. You're starting to remember. A pit opened up in my stomach.
I wanted to scream, to throw the phone across the room, but I couldn't. Instead, I typed back, my fingers flying across the screen with a mind of their own. Why me? Why now? The reply was instant, almost like he had been waiting for me to ask. You
were chosen. We made a deal and I've held up my end. Now you live the life you wanted and I take what I'm owed. That's how it works, Mandy. Always has. Always will. The weight of the words crushed me. I had been chosen. Chosen for what?
I didn't even remember making a deal. How could I have agreed to something like this?
And yet, the evidence was right in front of me, carved into those stones, written in the blood of the people I had once cared about. I stood up abruptly, the sudden movement making my vision blur. I stumbled toward the kitchen, needing something, anything, to ground me in reality. I grabbed the nearest object, a glass of water, and gulped it down, trying to calm my shaking hands. The cool liquid helped, but only for a moment. In the eerie quiet of my apartment, I heard the faint strains of Vivaldi still playing. The music, once comforting, now seemed out of place, too refined for the chaos I felt inside. I crossed the room, fumbling for the remote, and clicked the music off. Silence pressed in, thick and suffocating. I couldn't stay here. Not with those rocks, not with the names of the dead circling my mind like vultures. I needed answers, but
I didn't know where to start. The police? The man from the train had been involved somehow. Could they track him down? But what would I say? That I had made a deal with some stranger who took my friends in exchange for a life of luxury.
It sounded insane, even to me. But then maybe I was insane. I looked down at my phone again, half expecting another message, another cryptic reply. Instead, there was only silence. Without really thinking, I grabbed my coat and keys, leaving the
rocks where they lay, staring at me with all their unanswered questions. I needed air. I needed to move. Maybe if I could walk, I could clear my head, figure out what to do next. I stepped out into the crisp night air, the cold biting at my skin as I hurried down the street. The city was alive around me, people bustling.
In and out of shops, taxis honking, streetlights flickering. I blended into the crowd, just another face, just another person trying to escape their own ghosts. But no matter how fast I walked, no matter how far I went, the weight of those stones pressed down on me. Their names haunted me, just like the memories I had buried for so long. You can't run from it forever, Mandy. His voice echoed in my mind. I wasn't sure I could run at all. It was a chilly December morning, and I decided it was the perfect time to take a solo camping trip. The holiday season had everyone bustling around, so I knew the campgrounds would be quiet. I had just bought a fancy new glamping tent, and this seemed like the best time to break it in. After cooking myself a mushroom omelette, I grabbed my camping checklist. I made sure I had all the essentials: my canteen, portable satellite, sleeping bag, glamping tent, portable heater, laptop, snacks, lantern, and the trusty tent lock. Once I was packed and ready, I set off. Before hitting the campground, I stopped at a nearby gas station to fuel up and grab some chips. As I was waiting to pay, I noticed an old man. He must have been in his 90s, with a shock of grey hair and a red cashmere sweater. He was buying a crowbar and a garbage bag. I couldn't help but stare at him, but the cashier's voice interrupted my thoughts, and I left the store without giving it much more thought. After a few hours of driving, I finally arrived at the park. The toll booth operator greeted me, telling me that campsite 12 was still available, and, to my surprise, the park was free today. I followed his directions to the campsite, excited to get set up. The trees swayed gently against a fiery orange sky, and I couldn't have imagined a more perfect spot. I spent the next hour setting up my tent, heater, and satellite, making sure I had everything in place before nightfall. Once everything was ready, I crawled into my sleeping bag, locking the tent behind me for extra security. I felt peaceful until I woke up thirsty in the middle of the night. As I reached for my canteen, I saw something outside, a silhouette
Of a man holding what looked like a crowbar. My heart raced.
The figure disappeared as quickly as it appeared, but my nerves were on edge. I grabbed my lantern and hesitated. I had to check if my satellite was working, so I cautiously unzipped the tent and stepped outside. That's when I saw it, a body,
Hanging from a tree in a garbage bag with the words, "You're next," written in blood. Terror gripped me. I darted back into my tent, locking myself in again and trying to sleep, though my heart pounded the entire night. When morning came,
the body was gone. I packed my things quickly and called the police. They said they would arrive by midday. Something felt very wrong, so I called the park office too, but they hung up on me. I knew I had to leave. Without thinking, I started hiking back toward the parking lot, but in my panic, I took a wrong turn. I stumbled upon a log cabin by a lake, and to my horror, I saw the same old blue pickup truck from the gas station. I turned and sprinted in the opposite direction, retracing my steps until I finally reached the parking lot. Just as I was about to escape, the gates shut in front of me. A voice called out behind me, "You thought you could escape that easily?" Was the toll booth operator. He stepped into view, glaring at me. "I own this park, and for years, people have treated me like dirt. Now it's my turn to take control." Before I could react, a loud clang echoed through the air, and the toll booth operator crumpled to the ground. Standing behind him was the old man from the gas station, holding the crowbar. "Let's get you out of here, kid," the old man said, helping me into my car. I was too stunned to speak, but I drove away as fast as I could. In my rearview mirror, I saw the old man tying up the deranged toll booth operator. Weeks later, I learned that the operator had been sentenced to life in prison, and the old man had taken over the park's operations. Turns out, the man I had
feared was actually my savior. I guess that goes to show you really shouldn't judge a book by its cover.
The officers moved quickly, sweeping the house with flashlights and calling out Anne's name. Their voices echoed down the halls, blending with the haunting melody that seemed to have taken up permanent residence in my mind. My wife, pale and trembling, clung to Emily, who stared blankly at the commotion, unable to comprehend what was happening. I couldn't stop pacing, the gnawing fear in my gut making it impossible to stay still. Every room they checked and found empty felt like another nail being driven into my chest. My hands shook as I gripped the edge of the kitchen counter, trying to steady myself. One of the officers, a tall man with a heavy brow, came over. "We've searched the house thoroughly," he said, his voice steady but strained. "There's no sign of forced entry. No footprints outside the window, no indication she left on her own." "But she's gone," I said, my voice cracking. "She wouldn't just disappear. I heard the whistling. There was someone outside her window. I know there was." The officer glanced at the others, a flicker of disbelief in his eyes, but he didn't outright dismiss me. "We'll widen the search. I'll have units comb the woods. But, sir," his tone softened, "it's important to stay calm. Children sometimes wander off. Maybe she's hiding. We'll find her." I nodded numbly, though deep down I knew this was different. The eerie whistling still rang in my ears, a ghostly tune that seemed to grow louder every time I tried to block it out. As the night wore on, more officers arrived, along with search dogs and flashlights cutting through the shadows outside. My wife stayed glued to Emily, trying to keep her calm, though I could see the fear etched in her face. She hadn't said much since the police had arrived, but the haunted look in her eyes said everything. She knew something was horribly wrong, just like I did. Hours passed. The search stretched into the early morning, and still there was no sign
of Anne. Every minute that ticked by felt like a lifetime, and I felt the walls closing in on me. The house, once a beautiful refuge for our family, now felt suffocating, like it was closing its grip around us. Finally, the lead officer returned, his face grim. "We've searched the entire perimeter. There's no trace of her." The weight of his words hit me like a truck. I collapsed into a chair, my mind spinning. How could she have just vanished? There were no answers, only more questions. And the whistling, it still hadn't stopped. Every time I tried to focus, it was there, faint and distant, like a constant reminder of what I'd lost. As the officers started to pack up, I heard a soft knock at the door. One of the officers answered it, and a woman stepped in, her face shadowed by the dim light. She was older, with deep lines etched into her face and sharp, piercing eyes that seemed to see straight through me. The officer gave her a nod. "This is Mrs. Agnes. She's lived in the area a long time. Thought she might be able to help." Agnes moved slowly, her eyes never leaving mine. "I heard about the whistling," she said, her voice low and steady. "You heard it too, didn't you?" I nodded, my throat tight with emotion.
"Yes, it's been following me. And now my daughter, she's gone." Please, if you know anything, you have to help me." She sighed deeply, her hands trembling slightly as she clasped them in front of her. "The Whistler," she muttered. "I've heard stories about it my whole life, but I thought they were just old wives' tales, superstitions. No one's heard it in years." "The Whistler?" I echoed, a chill creeping down my spine. "What is it?" Agnes glanced at the floor, as if weighing whether to tell me the truth. "They say it's a spirit, something old, older than this town. It comes to those who invite it in by whistling at night. The sound lures it, draws it closer. Once it's heard, it's nearly impossible to stop. It feeds on the silence after the whistle, and when it comes for you, it takes something precious." My heart pounded in my chest. "But I didn't mean to."
"Invite anything." I didn't know. Agnes's gaze softened, and she took a step closer. "I know you didn't. But it doesn't matter. Once it's been invited, it doesn't leave until it's claimed what it wants.
"What can I do?" I asked, desperation clawing at me. "How do I get her back?" She shook her head slowly. "I don't know if you can, but you have to try. It wants more than just your daughter. It'll take everything from you if you let it. The Whistler doesn't stop once it's started." Her words hit me like a sledgehammer. I felt the weight of everything crashing down on me, suffocating me. I looked around the room at my wife, at Emily, and then back at Agnes. "There has to be a way," I whispered, my voice barely audible. Agnes hesitated, then spoke again. "There's one thing I've heard of, an old ritual, but it's dangerous."
"And there's no guarantee it'll work?" I didn't care about the danger.
I didn't care about anything except getting Anne back. "Tell me what I have to do." Agnes took a deep breath and nodded slowly. "All right, but once you start, there's no turning back." I shook my head, trying to fight the heavy pull.
Of sleep. The whistling was doing something to us, lulling us into unconsciousness. I looked over at Emily, whose eyes were beginning to droop. I had to do something, anything to keep us awake. "Stay with me," I whispered to my wife, gripping her hand. "We can't let it take us." But her head was already falling forward, her body swaying as she struggled to stay upright. Panic clawed at my chest, and I slapped my face, trying to jolt myself awake. "Emily!" I shouted, my voice hoarse with desperation. "Wake up!" Her small figure stirred on the bed, her eyes fluttering open in confusion. I rushed over, shaking her gently. "You have to stay awake, sweetheart. Do you hear me? Don't
Close your eyes." But even as I spoke, the whistling grew louder, more hypnotic, pulling us deeper into its grasp. The melody was relentless, winding its way through my mind like a serpent. I could feel my consciousness slipping, the edges of my vision darkening. Suddenly, there was a loud knock at the door. The sound was so sharp, so out of place in the eerie silence, that it jolted me awake. My wife gasped, snapping back to attention as well. Without thinking, I ran to the door, my heart racing. I hesitated for a moment, then slowly opened it, half expecting to see something terrifying waiting on the other side. But instead, Agnes stood there, her face grim, a large bag slung over her shoulder. "We don't have much time," she said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "It started. If you want any chance of saving your daughter, we have to act now." "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. "What's happening?" "The whistling," Agnes said, setting her bag down on the motel room table and pulling out various items, candles, small jars filled with herbs, and what looked like a bundle of twigs tied together with red string. "It's not just a sound, it's a lure. It's trying to pull you all into its world, just like it did with Anne." "What can we do?" My wife's voice was shaking, but her grip on my hand was strong. Please, tell us how to stop it." Agnes lit the candles, arranging them in a circle around the room. The flames flickered in the dim light, casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. This ritual is old, older than anything I've seen before. It might not work, but it's your only shot. She placed the bundle of twigs in the center of the circle, then sprinkled herbs over it, chanting words under her breath that I didn't understand. The air in the room grew thick and heavy, a strange energy pulsing through the space. As Agnes worked, the whistling intensified, growing louder and more frantic. It was as if the entity knew what we were trying to do, and it didn't like it. The walls seemed to vibrate with the sound, and the temperature in the room dropped sharply. "Stay inside the circle," Agnes instructed, her voice firm. "No matter what happens, do not leave this space." I nodded, pulling Emily and my wife into the circle with me. The whistling was unbearable now, drilling into my skull, making it hard to think, hard to breathe. I clung to Emily, holding her close, my heart pounding in my chest. Suddenly, the lights flickered, then went out entirely. The room plunged into darkness, save for the flickering candle flames. The whistling stopped abruptly, replaced by an oppressive, suffocating silence. For a moment, everything was still. Then from the far corner of the room, I saw it. A shadow, darker than the rest, slowly creeping toward us. It was tall, unnaturally thin, with long, spindly limbs that seemed to stretch impossibly far. My breath caught in my throat as the figure moved closer, its form barely visible in the dim light. The air grew colder, and I felt a deep, primal fear take hold of me. This was it, the Whistler. Agnes continued her chanting, her voice steady despite the growing tension in the room. The shadow hovered just outside the circle, its presence heavy and menacing. Then, without warning, it lunged. The candles flared, their flames shooting up in a blinding burst of light. The shadow recoiled, retreating with a sound that was somewhere between a hiss and a growl. Agnes's voice grew louder, more urgent, as she continued the ritual, her hands moving in swift, practiced motions. For what felt like an eternity, the Whistler and Agnes seemed locked in a silent battle, the entity testing the boundaries of the circle, pushing against the invisible barrier that kept it at bay. Finally, after what seemed like hours, Agnes spoke the final words of the ritual. The candles flickered one last time, then went out, plunging the room into darkness once more. I held my breath, waiting for the whistling to return, for the shadow to reappear. But the silence that followed was different. It was calm, peaceful. The oppressive weight that had hung over us lifted, and I could breathe again. Agnes slumped to the floor, exhausted but triumphant.
"It's gone," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "For now." My wife let out a sob of relief, pulling Emily close. I knelt beside Agnes, my heart still racing. "Is it over? Is Anne?" Agnes shook her head slowly. "It's not over. The Whistler is weakened, but it's not defeated. If you want to get Anne back, you'll have to confront it. There's a place deep in the woods where the boundary between our world and theirs is thin. That's where you'll find her. But be warned, it won't let her go without a fight." I
Felt a cold dread settle in my stomach. The thought of facing that thing again was terrifying, but if there was even a chance of saving Anne, I knew I had to try. "When do we leave?" I asked, my voice steady despite the fear gnawing at me. Agnes looked up at me, her eyes filled with both fear and determination. "At dawn." It began with Anne's disappearance, a night that felt too surreal to be true. My family was whole, safe, until that night. But the whistling, it lured her away and the police found nothing. Now here I sit, desperate, terrified, trying to understand how everything spiraled out of control. The motel was supposed to be a sanctuary, a place where we could escape the presence that had invaded our home. But as the haunting melody filled the air, it became clear that no place was safe. The whistler was everywhere, stalking us with that eerie, bone-chilling tune. It stole Anne, and now it's after Emily. I couldn't stop it. I tried everything, staying awake, praying, reasoning with the irrational. But as soon as Emily opened that motel door and stepped into the void, I knew I'd lost. My little girl, gone, like her sister before her. I returned to the house with Sarah, thinking perhaps there was something we missed, some clue to help us unravel this nightmare. But the house wasn't the same. The air felt thick, like we were wading through molasses. The walls seemed to close in around us, and that oppressive silence filled every corner. What had once been a warm and loving home had turned into a place of nightmares. I admitted to Sarah that it might be my fault, that somehow my whistling had beckoned the entity closer night after night, until it finally took what it wanted. I didn't want to believe it, but as soon as we pulled into the driveway, I felt it. The house was waiting for us, eager, like it knew we would return. We split up, Sarah heading upstairs while I checked the backyard. I searched every corner, every shadow, but it was as if the girls had vanished into thin air. There were no footprints, no signs of struggle, nothing. I was about to head back inside when I felt it. That strange sensation of being watched, of something lurking just out of sight. My skin prickled with unease, but I couldn't let fear control me. Not now. Inside, the house was too quiet. Every step I took felt like walking into a deeper abyss. My heart pounded in my chest, each thump echoing in the stillness. Then I heard it, a voice, my voice, calling out from the basement. "Sarah," it called, mimicking me perfectly, but wrong in
a way I couldn't explain. My blood ran cold.
It was trying to lure her, just as it had lured Emily. I texted Sarah, warning her not to trust any voice, but by then I feared it was too late. I heard her call out for me, her voice full of confusion, as she moved toward the basement. Panic surged through me as I sprinted to the stairs, but the hallway stretched impossibly long. By the time I reached the basement door, the sound of it slamming shut echoed in the empty house. She was gone, taken, just like the girls. The house held, its breath as if savoring the moment. I was alone now, the weight of the loss crashing down on me. My family, my wife, my daughters were gone, swallowed by the darkness that seemed to live within these walls. And there was nothing I could do to bring them back. I stumbled upstairs, searching for answers that weren't there. Every room felt like a tomb filled with memories of a life that no longer existed. And then I heard it, the whistling. It started softly, a distant melody that grew louder with each passing second. My heart raced, fear clawing at my chest as I realized the truth. It wasn't just in my head anymore, it was real, manifesting in the house, coming for me. I ran to the bedroom, slamming the door shut behind me, but the sound followed, growing.
Louder, more insistent. I hid in the closet, trembling, knowing it was only a matter of time before it found me. The whistling was right outside the door now, seeping through the cracks, wrapping itself around me like a noose.
I could feel its presence, cold and menacing just beyond the thin barrier of wood. It was here for me now. I scribble these final words in a desperate attempt to warn anyone who finds them. The whistler isn't just a sound, it's a force, an
entity, and once it sets its sights on you, there's no escape. Don't make the same mistake I did. Don't whistle past midnight, because if you do, it will come for you too.
Her face was pale, eyes wide with a mixture of shock and fear, her breathing shallow. She looked at me, but it was as if she didn't truly see me, her gaze distant and unfocused. "Are you okay?" I asked, more urgently now, kneeling beside
Her. She blinked rapidly, as if trying to snap herself out of whatever had gripped her. Finally, she whispered, "It was him. He was here." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. "Who was here?"
She didn't answer immediately, but after a few moments, she managed to speak. "The old man. The one who used to live here. He was standing right there." She pointed to the far corner of the room, her hand trembling. "He was watching."
Me, smiling. I looked at the corner, half expecting to see something, anything, but it was empty, just a shadowed space in the dim light of the room.
My rational mind told me that it was impossible. The man had been dead for months, but the fear in her voice, the sheer terror on her face was undeniable. "It's okay," I said softly, trying to calm her. "You're just shaken up. Let's get out of here for a moment. Some fresh air will help." She nodded weakly, still staring at the corner as I helped her up from the bed. Just as we turned to leave the room, a faint creak echoed through the house. We both froze. The sound had come from somewhere deeper in the house, possibly the hallway, or even the kitchen. The dark-haired woman's grip tightened on my arm. "He's still here." I forced a calm I didn't feel, and led her towards the front door, my heart racing. Every step felt heavier, as if the very air around us was thickening, pressing down, trapping us inside. As we reached the hallway, I noticed something strange. The suitcases that had been there just moments ago were gone. I stopped, my pulse quickening. "Where are your things?" I asked, looking around frantically. She looked confused, glancing down the hallway. "They were right here. We packed them this morning." Panic started to bubble up inside me. The house felt different now, darker, oppressive, like something unseen was watching, waiting. "We need to leave now," I said, pulling her toward the door. Just as my hand touched the doorknob, the lights flickered and went out, plunging us into darkness. The house creaked again, louder this time, and from somewhere in the distance I could have sworn I heard a faint whisper, a voice that sounded disturbingly familiar. I fumbled in my pocket for my phone, using the dim light from the screen to
"Illuminate the door." My fingers trembled as I turned the knob, but the door wouldn't budge. I pulled harder, but it felt like it was locked, or worse, like something was holding it shut from the other side. "Come on," I muttered, frustration
and fear overtaking me. I yanked at the door with all my strength, but it stayed firmly in place. The dark-haired woman began to sob softly beside me. "We're not getting out, are we?" she whispered. "Don't say that," I replied, trying to sound confident, though I wasn't sure anymore. I turned around to see if there was another way out, and that's when I noticed it, a faint glow, coming from the far end of the hallway near the study. It was the same corner she had pointed to before, where she said the old man had been standing. "Stay here," I told her, my voice barely steady. She grabbed my arm. "Don't go," she pleaded, her voice shaking. "I'll just be a second," I reassured her, though I didn't believe my own words. Something was wrong, very wrong, and I needed to know what it was. Slowly, I made my way down the hallway, the glow becoming brighter with each step. When I reached the study, I stopped. The glow was coming from a small, old-fashioned radio sitting on the desk. It was on, though I hadn't noticed it before. The static-filled noise was soft but unnerving. I moved closer and reached for the dial, intending to turn it off. When the sound changed, the static faded and a voice came through, a woman's voice. "I'm here. I'm not disappearing." My hand froze above the radio, my heart pounding in my chest. It was the same phrase the blonde woman had mentioned earlier, the one they had heard the night before. As I stood there, transfixed, the air around me grew colder, and I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. Slowly, I turned.
Around, and there they were, the man and woman from my dream, standing in the doorway. Their faces were shadowed, but I could see their smiles, wide and unnatural. They were looking directly at me now, their eyes glinting in the dim light of...
"The radio, I'm here," the woman repeated, her voice a soft whisper, though her lips didn't move. I took a step back, my mind racing. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But there they were, as real as anything I'd ever seen, standing in front of me, their hands slowly reaching out as if to grab me. Without thinking, I turned and ran, back down the hallway, past the dark-haired woman who was now screaming toward the front door. My hands fumbled with the lock, and with a final desperate pull, the door flew open and we stumbled outside into the fresh air. The woman collapsed on the porch, sobbing uncontrollably. I stood there, panting, my heart racing as I looked back.
At the house, the lights were back on, and from the window I saw a shadow pass by, moving through the house as if nothing had happened. "Let's go," I said, helping the woman to her feet.
We needed to get away from there, from whatever was inside that house. As we walked away, I glanced back one last time, and for a brief moment I thought I saw them again, the couple standing in the window, watching us with those same unnatural smiles. But when I blinked, they were gone. As the car disappeared down the gravel road, a chill settled over me, the kind that gnawed at the edges of my mind. The Bentley, the woman in the driver's seat, it was all too familiar. I stood there, staring at the dust cloud left behind, my thoughts racing. Could it have been her, the old neighbor's wife? But that made no sense. She had died years ago. I shook my head, trying to clear the strange thoughts swirling in my mind. It had to be a coincidence. Maybe someone else in the area drove a similar car, though I had never seen another Bentley around here before. And yet the unease wouldn't leave me. Turning back to the house, I hesitated. Part of me wanted to leave, to wash my hands of the whole bizarre situation. But something kept pulling
me back.
The dreams, the strange encounters, the house itself, it all felt connected, like there was a puzzle that hadn't yet been solved. Against my better judgment, I found myself walking back toward the house. The door was still ajar from when we'd rushed out. The quiet inside seemed heavier now, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. I stepped inside, closing the door softly behind me, and stood in the hallway, listening. Nothing. The oppressive silence was almost worse than the strange noises and whispers. My pulse quickened as I made my way through the house, stopping at each room, scanning for any sign of what might be behind all of this. The air felt thick with an unseen presence, the kind of heaviness that pressed down on your chest and made every breath a conscious effort. I found myself drawn to the study, again, where the old radio still sat on the desk, its dial now dark. I hesitated before walking over to it, half expecting it to crackle to life again with that eerie voice. But nothing happened. I reached out and touched the cold surface of the radio, and that's when I noticed something strange. There were papers scattered across the desk, documents, letters, photographs. They looked old, yellowed with time, but one of the photos caught my eye. It was a picture of my old neighbor and his wife, taken sometime in the late 70s by the look of it. They were standing in front of the house, smiling at the camera. But there was something off about the photo. I squinted, bringing it closer to the dim light filtering in through the window. The couple looked younger, but the woman's face was oddly familiar, more so than it should have been. My heart skipped a beat as realization dawned on me. The woman in the photo, the one standing next to my neighbor, was the same woman I'd seen in the driver's seat of the Bentley, the same woman who had just driven away with the two renters. A cold wave of dread washed over me. This couldn't be possible. She was dead. And yet, I had seen her. I was sure of it. I dropped the photo back onto the desk, my hands shaking. This wasn't just some creepy coincidence or an overactive imagination. Something far stranger was happening here. Before I could gather my thoughts, I heard a soft creak from the hallway. My body tensed, and I slowly turned toward the sound. There, standing just inside the doorway, was the old man, the neighbor. He wasn't transparent or ghostly, but solid, real. He stood there, watching me with that same unsettling smile I'd seen in my dreams. My throat went dry, and I tried to speak, but no words came out. "You shouldn't have come back," he said, his voice low and measured, almost calm. I backed up a step, my heart hammering in my chest. You're not real," I finally managed to stammer. He didn't move, didn't blink. "Real enough," he said softly, that smile never leaving his face. "You're in my house now." I glanced around, searching for an escape, but I was frozen, in place. The room felt smaller, like the walls were closing in, the air thick with an overwhelming sense of dread. The old man took a step forward, his eyes locked onto mine. "I didn't want any of this. I just wanted to be left alone."
"But she won't let go. She's still here, waiting." "Who?" I croaked, already knowing the answer. "My wife," he said, his voice a whisper now. "She never left." I took another step back, but my foot caught on something and I stumbled. As I struggled to regain my balance, the lights in the house
flickered, and the temperature seemed to drop several degrees. The atmosphere in the room became suffocating. "She's always here," he continued, his voice growing distant, almost as if he were talking to himself now. "I hear her every
night, laughing, watching. She won't let me go."
His eyes shifted to something behind me, and before I could turn to see what he was looking at, I felt it, a presence, cold and unnerving, standing just inches away. A chill ran down my spine as I slowly turned around. There she was, the old woman, the neighbor's wife. She stood right behind me, her face a mask of malice, her eyes gleaming with something dark and unfathomable, and she was smiling, that same twisted smile from the dream. "I'm here," she whispered, her voice sending a wave of terror through me. "I'm not disappearing." Without thinking, I bolted. I ran down the hallway, my footsteps echoing through the house as I tore towards the front door. My hands fumbled with the lock, but this time it gave way easily, and I stumbled outside into the fading light of the afternoon. I didn't stop running until I was halfway across the meadow, my lungs burning and my heart pounding in my ears. When I finally looked back, the house stood there, still and quiet, the windows dark. But I could feel them watching, their presence lingering in the air, like a shadow that wouldn't fade. I knew in that moment that the house wasn't just haunted, it was alive in its own twisted way. And whatever had happened there, whatever strange bond the old man and his wife had shared, it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The house had claimed them, and now it was looking for someone new.
"I bought this at a charity shop on Market Street," squealed my grandmother, excitement in her voice. "It looked like something you two would love." The box she held was rigid, its cardboard far too firm for what appeared to be its age. It was marked with black serif font that read, "Peter's Place."
The cover depicted a small, purple plastic figure striding forward, seemingly indifferent to the white plastic figures chasing after it. They all seemed to be heading towards a house in the distance, a childlike outline of a home, a triangle roof, 4 windows, and a door. The colors on the cover were faded, as if some details had been lost to time, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had disappeared might have told us more about the game. Maybe it would have even warned us never to play it. Grandma placed the box on the coffee table with pride, and I shot a smug glance at my younger sister Michaela, who stifled laughter. We'd never been fans of board games, but it was hard to say no to Grandma, especially these days. A few months ago, our parents had finally told us the truth. Grandma was showing early signs of vascular dementia. It explained the lapses in memory we'd noticed during our visits over the years. Knowing her time with us was limited made us more willing to indulge her, even if it meant spending an evening playing an old board game. Whether it was that, or another night of watching Antiques Roadshow, we knew we'd do whatever it took to make her happy. "What are the rules, Emmett?" Grandma asked, looking at me. I lifted the lid of the box. It resisted slightly, like it didn't want to be opened, but after a moment, it came free with a loud scrape. "You need to hit the gym, Spaghetti Limbs," Michaela teased. I grinned and, without thinking, swung the lid playfully, accidentally thumping her on the nose. She recoiled, laughing, but Grandma's eyes suddenly glazed over. "Where did this game come from? It looks like fun," she said, her tone softer now, more uncertain. I sighed, feeling a weight in the air. "You got it for us, Grandma, from that shop on Market Street." "Oh," she murmured, clearing her throat as though trying to push past her confusion. Yes, that's right. Let's play, shall we?" I smiled, trying to lighten the moment. "First, I need to read the
"Rules. And you better explain them, Cheetah," Michaela added, flashing a playful glare. "Of course," I chuckled. "I'll read them word for word, and I bet you'll still spend 20 minutes checking the rulebook to make sure I didn't lie."
That's right," Michaela said, with a nod. "And after that, one of you will have to read them again because I'll have forgotten by then," Grandma chimed in with a giggle. We all laughed, but there was a hint of sadness in the room. Grandma's wit still surfaced sometimes, but those moments were fewer and farther between. The diagnosis had changed everything. Every joke, every shared memory felt like a fragile thing slipping through our fingers. We were laughing, but grief lingered just beneath the surface. Grief for the woman Grandma used to be, the sharp mind that was slowly fading. I cleared my throat to break the silence and began explaining the rules. Peter's Place. The house is home. It safeguards everything that is precious to you, everything you hold dear. But now you are displaced, and you must return to that house. Unfortunately, you are not the only one with eyes on that sanctuary. Peter has seen that you are far from home, and he intends to take everything from you. You and your teammates must work together to reach the house. Each player controls a white figure, and after every turn, Peter, the purple figure, moves one square closer to the house. You win if all players reach the house before Peter. You lose if it becomes Peter's place. Peter cannot be stopped. He moves steadily without pause, and no obstacle can slow him down. You, however, may grow weary. The journey may take everything from you. After each move, you will draw an item card and a choice card corresponding to the color of the square you land on, either red or green. Event squares trigger an event card. If a player reaches the house, they no longer need to draw cards. Once everyone crosses the finish line, a final event card will determine your victory or defeat. Peter is ambitious, acquisitive, and self-serving. To him, the house is not a home, it is food, and he will stop at nothing to take it from you. One day, Peter will have his place. When all players are ready, the game begins. Grandma sighed. That was a lot to take in. I smiled, trying to reassure her. It's simpler than it sounds. It's a strategy game, but nothing too complex. Think of it like chess. You're good at chess. And we're all working together, Michaela added. So we'll help you out. That's right, I nodded. Let's give it a try. I started unfolding the board, revealing a maze of paths that all led to a simple, featureless house at the center. Some routes passed through a dense forest, others through an abandoned town. There were dozens of different ways to reach the house, but no clear indication of which was safest. The quickest path seemed to hug the border between the forest and the town, but something about the green squares on that route made me uneasy. I couldn't shake the feeling that Peter's place was more than just a game. It was almost as if the board itself wanted me to linger, to stare too long at the paths that would soon lead us to trouble. What are you holding, Emmett? Grandma
asked, snapping me out of my thoughts. I realized I'd been absent-mindedly holding an old cotton bag from the box. I opened it and pulled out 4 small figurines, 3 white and 1 purple. What are the odds? Michaela said with a laugh. It's like the game was made for us. Her words sent a chill down my spine.
I couldn't explain why, but the thought of playing this game unnerved me. Still, I wasn't about to back out. Not tonight. Not when it mattered to Grandma. We placed the white pieces on the starting square, and I carefully set the purple figure on its own track. Peter's route was shorter, with fewer obstacles. He would move slowly but surely toward the house, and we would have to outrun him. We're in a hurry, aren't we? Grandma chuckled, picking up one of the white figures. It's been a long time since I could run like this. And look at Peter, Michaela added, pointing to the purple piece. He's hardly even trying. Are we ready? I asked, hesitating for a moment. Or should we watch TV instead? No, Grandma said firmly. Let's play. I nodded, knowing that these moments with her were fleeting. Soon we might not be able to play games at all. Who goes first? I asked, holding up the first piece. Grandma smiled. I'll go. Just move the piece for me. It's hard for me to reach from here. I placed the figure on the board and glanced toward the back door, which had suddenly clicked open. A chill ran through me. The back door had been locked. The moment I read those words, a cold sweat formed on my brow, and my stomach lurched. My mind raced as I stared at the crudely etched message on the underside of the game box. Can't kill it, don't play it. Who had written that? And more importantly, what did it mean? I was paralyzed for a moment, feeling as though the air
had thickened around me, pressing in on my chest.
The eerie implications of the words gnawed at me like a dark whisper on the edge of my thoughts. My hands trembled as I flipped the box back over and tried to convince myself it was some prank. Maybe Michaela or one of her friends had scribbled it as a joke. But my gut told me otherwise. Everything about this game felt wrong, unnatural. It wasn't just the strange coincidences, the odd feelings, or the creeping unease that had built with every turn. There was something else, something beyond the game, lurking just out of sight. I was drawn back to the living room, to the game board itself. Peter's purple figurine stood in its new position, unmoved since Michaela had advanced it, but it now seemed more menacing. The tiny plastic piece felt like a symbol of something far more sinister, something waiting for us to make our next move. I didn't want to keep playing, but what could I say? Michaela and Grandma would return any moment, expecting me to have the game ready. I wiped my hands on my jeans, trying to calm myself, and checked my phone for the nearest takeaway options. Maybe a break for dinner would clear my head. Just as I was about to dial, I heard it, a soft, raspy sound, breathing. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably there, coming from the far corner of the room, the same empty corner where I'd thought I'd heard something earlier. My heart thudded in my chest as I slowly turned my head, forcing myself to confront the source of the noise. Nothing. The corner was empty, just like before. But the noise, it was still there. Shallow, steady breaths, as though something or someone was standing just out of sight. I swallowed hard and forced a laugh, trying to rationalize it. "It's the wind," I whispered to myself. "Just the wind." Then, as if on cue, the back door creaked open again. I leapt to my feet, nearly tripping over the game board, and sprinted to the hallway. The door was ajar, its latch still broken, and beyond it, that same dark and shapeless figure loomed at the edge of the forest. It hadn't moved since I first spotted it, but now it felt closer, more defined. My mouth went dry as I watched it, my muscles frozen in place. It watched me back.
I knew it was watching me, even though I couldn't see its eyes. Before I could think, I slammed the door shut, my chest heaving with panicked breaths. My mind screamed at me to run, to leave the house, to drag Grandma and Michaela out with me.
But I knew I couldn't. Whatever that thing was, it was waiting, and leaving the house wasn't going to change that. Footsteps echoed down the hall as Michaela helped Grandma back towards the living room. I had to pull myself together, act normal, and get through dinner without raising any alarms. "You all right, Emmett?" Michaela asked as she entered the room. She glanced at me curiously, noticing my pale face and shaky hands. I forced a smile, stuffing my phone into my pocket. "Yeah, just deciding on dinner. How does pizza sound?" "Sounds perfect," Michaela replied, her usual energy masking any concern. "We're starving." Grandma settled into her chair, smiling faintly, but looking more exhausted than before. "Pizza sounds lovely, dear, but are we continuing the game after?" I hesitated. Every part of me wanted to say no, to end this strange, creeping nightmare.
Once and for all, but something stopped me, like the pull of an invisible thread that tied me to the board. "Yeah."
"Sure," I said quietly, not even convincing myself. "We can finish." I ordered the pizza, trying to distract myself from the mounting fear. As we waited for the food, Grandma and Michaela chatted lightly about nothing in particular, their voices comforting in the growing darkness. But my eyes kept wandering back to the game, to the sinister little piece that was Peter. Each second felt heavier than the last, like the air was thickening with an unseen force, pressing down on all of us. I couldn't help but glance at the back door again, half expecting it to creak open. The door stayed closed, but I could still feel that presence, waiting just beyond the thin walls of the house. Finally, the pizza arrived, and we took a break from the game. But as we ate, I noticed how the conversation kept circling back to the board, like it had a gravitational pull of its own. Despite everything, we all seemed eager to continue playing, like the game was drawing us in, tempting us to finish what we'd started. By the time we sat back down, I had resolved to end it quickly, get through the turns, reach the end of the board, and never look at it again. But as I moved my piece forward, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, biding its time. Grandma took her next turn, her hands trembling slightly as she moved her piece back into the forest. She picked up another green card, her eyes narrowing as she read it. "The trees whisper your name," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "You hear footsteps, but when you turn, no one is there. Do you press forward, moving 2 spaces, or retreat, moving back 1 space and skipping your next turn?"
I think I'll go back," she said, her voice shaky. "I don't want to keep going." I moved her piece back, relieved that she was playing it safe. But the atmosphere in the room had shifted again. Michaela's light-hearted banter
had disappeared, replaced by a tense silence. My turn was next. I moved my piece cautiously forward, landing on a red square. I picked up an item card, bracing myself, a flashlight. I read aloud, trying to sound casual. "Good. You'll need it," Michaela said, her voice suddenly low, almost distant. I glanced at her, surprised by her tone, but she was focused on the board. By the time I reached Grandma's house, my hands were still trembling, my heart still racing. The pizzas sat cold on the passenger seat, forgotten as my mind replayed the events in that cursed supermarket. The laughter, the twisted face, the impossible smile. It was as if reality had been peeled back, revealing something monstrous beneath. The lights in the house were dim, and the sight of that cozy glow should have been comforting. But all I could think about was the message scratched into the box. "Can't kill it. Don't play it." I parked the car and sat there for a moment, my fingers gripping the wheel as I stared into the shadows beyond the driveway. The night was unsettlingly quiet, and the faintest rustle of leaves sent shivers down my spine. There was something out there. I couldn't see it, but I could feel its presence lurking just beyond the trees, watching me, waiting. Reluctantly, I stepped out of the car, pizzas in hand, and hurried to the front door. My fingers fumbled with the keys, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was drawing closer. The air seemed thicker, like it was pressing in on me. When I finally opened the door, I bolted inside, slamming it shut behind me. "Emmett, you're back," Michaela called from the living room, her voice sounding far too normal for the night I'd just endured. I forced a smile as I walked in, setting the pizzas down on the coffee table. Grandma was seated in her chair, her eyes half closed, looking peaceful, but I couldn't help but wonder if that was just a facade. The game board still lay between them, the figures on the board frozen in place as if waiting for something or someone. "Your turn," Michaela said with a teasing smile, pointing at my piece. I stared at the board, at the tiny figurines, and the unease that had settled deep within me flared up again. "I think we should stop playing." "What?" Michaela looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "We've barely even started." "No, seriously," I said, my voice rising slightly. "Something's wrong with this game," Michaela scoffed, rolling her eyes. "You're just scared because you got a creepy choice card. It's just a game, Emmett. You've been watching too many horror movies." I glanced at Grandma, but she didn't seem to notice the tension between us. She was lost in her own world, staring at the board with a peculiar focus. I'm not joking, I insisted, lowering my voice. Something's wrong.
Oh, with this game, I saw things at the store, Michaela. Things that shouldn't have been there. What are you talking about?
She asked, the playful smile slipping from her face as she noticed the fear in my voice. What did you see? A woman, if you can call her that, I said, my throat tight as I remembered her eyeless face, the grotesque smile. She wasn't
human. She chased me through the store, and before that, the entire town, it was empty, completely deserted. Michaela's expression shifted, a flicker of doubt crossing her face. Are you serious? I nodded, swallowing hard. I don't think this game is just a game, Michaela. There's something alive about it. Something dangerous. She hesitated, glancing down at the board. But how? It's just cardboard and plastic? That's what I thought too, I replied. But whatever's happening, it's real. And it started when we opened this box.
Michaela stared at the board, her fingers hovering over her piece as if she were considering moving it anyway. Then she looked up at me, her face pale. What do we do? We stop playing, I said firmly. We get rid of it. Burn it, if we have to. Grandma suddenly stirred in her chair, her voice soft but clear. You can't get rid of it? Both Michaela and I turned to look at her. Grandma's eyes were focused on the board, her hands trembling slightly in her lap. What do you mean? I asked. You can't kill it, she whispered, her voice a shadow of its usual warmth. Once you start playing, it never leaves. It stays with you, it follows. A cold chill ran down my spine. The words etched into the box flashed in my mind again. Can't kill it. Grandma, Michaela said gently, kneeling beside her. What are you talking about? Grandma's eyes were glazed over, distant, as if she were seeing something far beyond the room. It's been watching for years, waiting for someone to play. Now that you've started, it won't stop. I took a step back, my heart hammering.
In my chest. But we can stop, right? We can stop playing and it'll go away. Grandma slowly shook her head. No, it won't go away. It'll come for you, Emmett. It always does. I felt the room close in around me, the weight of
her words sinking deep into my chest. Michaela stood up, her face pale and drawn, as if she were realizing the gravity of the situation. So, what do we do? She whispered. I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that whatever had been unleashed by that game was far beyond our understanding, and it wasn't going to stop. Suddenly the room seemed darker, the shadows stretched longer, the corners of the room dimming as if the light itself were retreating. The air grew thick, heavy with an unspoken presence. And then, from the far end of the hallway, I heard it. A slow, deliberate knock on the door. Learn what exactly? Grandma, or rather the younger version of her, asked, trembling. Her voice was small, barely audible over the grinding of the metal beast. The man grabbed her by the arm, pulling her closer to the machine. You'll learn to obey, he snarled, his face twisted with anger. This is your family's legacy.
Annabelle, you can't run from it. I watched, helpless, as my grandmother was dragged toward the monstrous machine.
Its gears groaned and whirred, the blades inside slicing through the oats, as if they were nothing more than soft butter. A thick, acrid smell hung in the air, burning oats mixed with something I couldn't quite place. Blood? It felt like the machine was alive, feeding on more than just grain. Annabelle, my grandma, struggled in the man's grip. Tears streamed down her young face, her voice cracking with fear. I didn't ask for this. I don't want it. You don't have a choice. The man's grip tightened as he forced her closer to the grinding metal. "This land, this farm, it's cursed because of your family. You think you can just abandon it. You think you can escape." I tried to scream, to move, to do anything, but my body was frozen, glued to the spot as I watched the horror unfold. It was like being trapped in a nightmare. The world around me spun in slow motion, every sound distorted, every movement a haze. Then I saw it, the box. The very same game box that had sat innocuously in Grandma's house, taunting us all night. It rested on a nearby conveyor belt, inching ever closer to the monstrous machine. As it moved, the lights flickered again, casting the room in a harsh, sickly glow. Something about the box seemed alive, pulsating with an unseen energy, as though it were feeding on the fear and chaos. Suddenly the man released Annabelle and turned toward the box. "The source," he muttered, his voice a deep growl. "The damn game. It must be destroyed." He reached for it, but before he could lay a hand on the cursed object, a loud snap echoed through the factory. One of the machine's gears had jammed, sending sparks flying across the room. Annabelle seized the opportunity, scrambling away, from the man and towards a rusted door at the far end of the factory. "Run, Grandma!" I screamed, finally able to move my limbs. But my voice echoed hollowly, unheard, as if I was speaking from another dimension. The man snarled again, enraged. His body twisted unnaturally as he lunged after her, but just as he reached her, the machine let out a deafening roar. The conveyor belt carrying the box jerked violently, pulling the man into the spinning blades. I winced, turning away, as a sickening crunch filled the room. The man's screams were cut short, swallowed by the metal beast. The factory fell silent. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my chest, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But before I could fully process it, the world around me shifted again. The lights flickered, and suddenly I was no longer in the factory. I was back in Grandma's living room, the game board still spread out before us. Michaela and Grandma sat in their chairs, just as they had been before. Both were staring at me with wide, unblinking eyes. "Emmett," Michaela whispered, her voice trembling. "Where did you go? What happened?" I don't know," I stammered, glancing down at the board. The pieces were still in place, just as we had left them. But something was different. The game wasn't over. "We finished," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "We crossed the line. It should be over." But as I looked closer, I saw the final event card I had drawn was still lying face up on the table. The words seemed to pulse, much like the box had in the factory. "It is time to put your decisions
"To the test," Michaela gasped, pointing to the board. "Emmett, look!" I followed her gaze, my stomach lurching. The game pieces, the tiny representations of us, were moving on their own.
Slowly, inexorably, they began to circle the house, the final destination. Over and over again, like we were caught in some endless loop. "We need to destroy it," Michaela whispered, her voice hoarse with fear. "The game, it's not finished. With us." I nodded, but before I could respond, the room around us began to darken again. The shadows crept in from every corner, swallowing the light, until all that remained was the glowing game board. Then, from the depths of the shadows,
I heard it, the laughter, that terrible,
inhuman laugh. It was her, the woman from the supermarket, and she was coming for us. The silence that followed was deafening. My sister stood frozen, the broadsword still raised in her trembling hands, her chest rising and falling with ragged breaths. The monstrous entities had been reduced to nothing but ash, dissolving into the earth like a nightmare, slipping through the cracks of reality. I rushed over to Michaela, my legs barely carrying me after the surreal terror we had just endured. "Michaela!" I gasped, grabbing her by the shoulders. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with disbelief as the sword clattered to the ground. "Emmett!" "What did I just do?" she whispered, staring down at the ash, her voice raw with fear and confusion. I didn't have the answer. Everything felt
Wrong, twisted, as if we had stepped into a world where the rules of reality had shattered like a broken mirror. The broadsword, the monsters, the factory, it all felt so impossibly real and yet absurdly detached from anything logical. I wanted to tell her it was all a dream, but we both knew it wasn't. "We need to go," I urged, pulling her towards the direction of Grandma's house. "Now, we need to find Grandma and get out of here." But deep down, I knew Grandma
was gone. The weight of that knowledge sank into my chest as we stumbled back through the field. The factory had vanished, the clearing now just a stretch of overgrown grass, but the dark presence of something far worse lingered in the air. The game. The cursed game that had brought us here. It wasn't finished with us yet. We crossed the threshold into the house, the door creaking as it swung shut behind us. Inside, the oppressive silence of the living room greeted us. The game board still sat there, unmoved, as if mocking us. I could feel the tension in Michaela, her body taut with apprehension, and I could sense the unspoken question hanging in the air. What now? "I don't want to touch that game again," she said, her voice barely a whisper. I nodded in agreement, but something told me it wouldn't be that simple. The game wasn't just a board, it was alive, feeding off our fear, our decisions,
our very existence. It had pulled us into its nightmarish web, and I doubted it would let us go without a fight. Suddenly the board shifted.
Without anyone touching it, the pieces began to move, slowly at first, then faster, spinning around the house in an unnatural pattern. A faint humming sound filled the room, growing louder, more menacing. The lights flickered and the air thickened with the same suffocating dread I had felt before. Then the final event card flipped over, revealing its ominous message. "You have played the game. Now the game plays you." A chill ran down my spine. "We have to end this," I muttered, stepping closer to the board. But how? Destroying it might only release whatever malevolent force was tied to it. Playing any further might push us deeper.
Into the abyss. Michaela, wide-eyed, backed away from the table.
"What does it mean, Emmett? What does it want?" "I don't know," I replied, panic bubbling up in my chest. "But we have to finish this." I reached out towards the board, but the moment my fingers brushed against the edge, a searing pain shot through my hand. I recoiled, clutching my wrist as an invisible force knocked me back. The game wasn't going to let us off that easily. The humming grew louder, more insistent, until it felt like the entire house was vibrating with the sound. Shadows danced along the walls, twisting and contorting into grotesque shapes. The room seemed to shrink, the walls closing in, trapping us within the game's malicious grip. In that moment, I knew what we had to do. "It's us," I whispered, realization dawning. "It's been us all along. The game. It's feeding."
Off our choices, our decisions. We can't destroy it, Michaela. We have to outplay it. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice shaking. I think the game needs us to make a final choice. We started this, and now we have to finish it together. Michaela looked at me, terror in her eyes, but she nodded. "Okay, let's end it."
We both moved towards the game board. The pieces had stopped spinning, resting in their final positions near the house. My heart pounded in my chest as we reached out, together, placing our hands on the board. The humming stopped. A voice, cold and distant, yet unmistakably familiar, whispered through the silence. Choose. I swallowed hard. The choices we had made in the game were now staring us in the face. The road we had taken, the weapons we had wielded, the monsters we had faced, all of it had led us here to this moment. We finished the game, I said, my voice steady despite the terror gnawing at my insides. No more running, no more hiding. Michaela's hand tightened on the board. Together, the room seemed to hold its breath as we made our final decision. The pieces on the board began to move again, but this time they didn't stop at the house. They moved beyond it, into the unknown. The board shifted and twisted, folding in on itself, the lines of the game blurring as reality and nightmare fused together. Then with a sudden, deafening crash, the game shattered. The pieces flew across the room, scattering like ashes. The board crumbled into dust, dissolving into the air, leaving nothing but an eerie stillness in its wake. The house was silent once more. Michaela and I stood there, staring at the empty table where the game had been. The nightmare was over, but the weight of everything we had experienced lingered. I knew we would never be the same. Is it really over? Michaela whispered, her voice fragile, as if she didn't quite believe it. I didn't have an answer, but as I pulled her into a tight hug, I hoped, prayed that it was. Because if it wasn't, I wasn't sure we'd survive the next round. The days that followed were a blur of nightmares, guilt, and a creeping dread that never left me. Michaela and I tried to settle back into some version of normalcy, but how do you return to normal when you've been pulled into something so far beyond your understanding? We never talked about that night again. Not really. Not in detail. We didn't talk about the shadows in the forest or the figure of Peter who had appeared and disappeared like some grim omen. We didn't talk about Grandma, at least not the version of her we had seen during the game, the one who had lived through unspeakable horrors at the hands of her husband. Instead, we filled our conversations with small talk. School, work, anything mundane to distract ourselves from the lingering presence of the game that still loomed in the back of my mind. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw that factory, saw Grandma's face as she aged in front of me, and saw myself running away when she needed me most. It ate away at me, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't truly escaped. Weeks turned into months, and for a time, life moved on. I was back in my dorm at college trying to focus on classes, but the box was always there. Sitting in the corner of my room, untouched but undeniably present. I had shoved it into the back of my closet, buried beneath layers of old clothes and forgotten things, but I knew it was there. Some nights I swore I could hear the faint sound of dice rolling or the whisper of the pieces shifting on their own. It was subtle, easy to write off as imagination, but I knew better. I knew the game was still waiting for something, for someone. Michaela and I had made an unspoken pact not to speak of it, but I could sense that she felt the same way. We were, both haunted in our own ways by the remnants of that night. I wondered if she too could feel the itch in the back of her mind, the quiet whisper that the game wasn't finished with us. It was a cold, rainy evening when I found myself staring at the closet. I had a paper due, but my mind kept wandering, back to the box. I hadn't touched it since that night, but now I found myself drawn to it. Maybe it was some twisted form of curiosity, or maybe it was the guilt gnawing at me like a festering wound. Before I knew it, I was standing in front
of the closet, my hand hesitating on the door handle.
A deep sense of foreboding settled over me, but I couldn't stop myself. I had to see it, had to know if it was still the same. I pulled the door open slowly, and there it was. The box sat in the same spot where I'd left it, as unassuming as ever. But even just looking at it, I could feel the weight of its presence pressing down on me. You have played the game. Now the game plays you. The words from that final event card echoed in my mind. I knelt down and gingerly pulled the box from its hiding place. It felt heavier in my hands than I remembered. As I set it down on my desk, I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. This was a mistake. I knew it was a mistake, but I couldn't stop. The lid was worn, just as it had been before, with its strange symbols and ominous design. I hesitated, my fingers grazing the edge of the lid, when I heard a knock on my door. I jumped, the sudden sound pulling me out of the trance-like
state I had fallen into. My heart raced as I turned towards the door. Emmett?
A familiar voice called softly, "Michaela?" I quickly shoved the box back into the closet and shut the door before rushing to let her in. She stood in the hallway, her face pale and drawn. Her eyes darted nervously around, as if she expected something to jump out at her from the shadows. "I couldn't sleep," she said, her voice barely above a whisper.
I keep seeing it. I didn't have to ask what she meant. I knew I was seeing it too. I can't stop thinking about him, she continued, stepping inside. About Peter. About how he looked at us. It's like I feel like he's still out there, like he's waiting. I swallowed hard, trying to push down the rising panic in my chest. "We finished the game, Michaela. It's over." "Is it?" She looked at me, her eyes filled with doubt. What if it never really ends? I didn't have an answer for her, because deep down I knew she was right. We sat in silence for a while, neither of us knowing what to say.
The rain pattered softly against the window, and for a brief moment it felt like we were back in Grandma's house, trapped in that nightmare all over again. Then, out of nowhere, Michaela stood up. "We should get rid of it." I stared at her. "The game?" She nodded, her jaw set with determination. "We've tried burning it, cutting it. Nothing worked. But we can't just leave it here. We can't keep living like this." She was right. We couldn't keep carrying the weight of that cursed thing. But the thought of getting rid of it filled me with dread. What if it found its way to someone else? What if it unleashed its horrors on another unsuspecting person? "We can't just dump it," I said, my voice trembling. "What if someone else finds it?" "We'll figure it out," Michaela replied. "But we can't let it control us anymore. We can't keep living in fear." Her words gave me strength, and for the first time in weeks I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe we could find a way to end this once and for all. As we stood there, ready to face whatever came next, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. That somewhere in the shadows, Peter was still watching, waiting. But no matter
what, we would face him together. And this time, we wouldn't let the game win, because one way or another, we would find a way to end it or die trying.
I'm not young, I'm not exactly old either, but definitely older than most of you reading this. I grew up in a time before smartphones, when the internet was just beginning, and there were no forums like this to share our weird or terrifying experiences. Looking back, I wish there had been something like that back then. Maybe I could have gotten some advice, or at least left a clearer record of what happened. My memories of that time are clouded by years of trying to forget, a mix of alcohol and bad decisions from my 20s, covering up the trauma. I had almost
buried it completely, but then, out of nowhere, it all came back. I guess my brain protected me for a long time, but now the memories are flooding to the surface. And with them comes the terror. But I'm jumping ahead. Let's go back. To where?
It all started. It was 1996 and I was 14, living in a small California mountain town. My parents had decided to move away from the city, buying a house in the middle of nowhere. My dad was tired of city life and wanted peace, where our closest neighbor would be nearly a mile away. To him, it was paradise. To me and my sister Katie, it was the end of everything we knew. Katie, being older by 2 years, adjusted quickly. She was pretty, outgoing, and made friends at school almost immediately. I wasn't as lucky. Awkward, quiet, and a bit of a loner, I struggled. It was an hour's bus ride to school and I felt like an outsider the whole time. Kids picked on me and I didn't fit in. My dad didn't care much about that. Instead, he saw it as an opportunity for me to toughen up and learn some practical skills. If you're not going to be out there with friends, you might as well learn how to take care of things around here, he said one morning. And just like that, my summer was gone. No more PlayStation, no more Resident Evil, just endless chores. I spent my summer cleaning gutters, mowing the lawn, repainting the garage, and, most importantly for this story, helping him build a new woodshed. Now, when I say I helped, what I really mean is that I did most of the work while he supervised. My dad always wanted me to be more hands-on, but I was the type of kid who preferred video games and drawing. Still, he pushed me through it, insisting that hard work would build character. "We got to get you some calluses, kiddo," he would say, clapping me on the back. Builds character. I'm not sure I built any character, but I definitely built that woodshed. The floor was made of old pallets, and we used huge, sharp aluminum sheets for the roof and walls.
I can't tell you how many times I cut myself on those damn sheets. By the end, I looked like I'd been in a fight with a box of razor blades. Sometimes I wonder if all that blood I spilled on the grass is what summoned him. Like I accidentally
Performed some kind of ritual without even knowing it. Step 1. Bleed all over your backyard while cursing about building a shed. Step 2. Wish you could do anything else but help your dad. Step 3. Summon an ancient evil that will haunt you for the
rest of your life. I'm kidding, of course. It wasn't the blood. And it wasn't the shed either, not really. The shed just happened to be where I first saw him. It was the night we finished building it. My dad was actually impressed with my work, which was rare. He even brought me a
Coke with dinner, saying it would have been a beer if I were older. For once, I felt like I'd done something right. As much as I make my dad sound like a hard ass, the truth is he was a good man, just old-fashioned. He was tough, sure, but he was proud of me that night. And for a few brief hours, everything felt normal. But that night, that was when everything changed. It was the night I saw him. The first appearance of the shadow. I am not young, but I am not exactly old either. Most of you reading this are probably younger than me. I grew up before the time of cell phones and social media, where the internet was still a novelty. Back then, there were no platforms like this to share our strange or scary stories. Maybe if there had been, someone could have helped me, or at least I would have had a better record of what happened than the fragmented memory clouded by years of numbing myself with alcohol. For a long time I had forgotten about the truth of this incident. That was until a few nights ago when it all came flooding back in the worst way possible. I think my brain had protected me from the trauma, burying it deep until something triggered the nightmare to resurface. This is that nightmare. The year was 1996. I was 14 years old, living in a small town in California. My parents had decided to move us to a secluded house in the mountains. My dad, tired of the city life, wanted to live where our closest neighbor was nearly a mile away. My older sister, Katie, and I were not thrilled about it. We left behind our friends, and it didn't help that the new school was a whole hour-long bus ride from our home. Katie, who was pretty, outgoing, and popular, made friends easily. I, on the other hand, was awkward, quiet, and always a bit of an outsider. I got picked on a lot. To make matters worse, my father was old school in every sense of the word. He saw the move as an opportunity to toughen me up and teach me some life skills. If you're just going to sit around all summer, you might
as well learn something, he said. That's how I found myself helping him with every household task that summer, from cleaning gutters to mowing the lawn, and finally, the job that would change everything, building a woodshed. I say I helped.
But in reality, my dad supervised while I did most of the work. It was a simple structure made mostly of old pallets and corrugated aluminum sheets. I was clumsy, cutting myself on the metal sheets more times than I could count. It felt like I was bleeding every day as I worked on that shed. Little did I know that she'd would be where it all began. The night I finished the woodshed, my dad actually told me I did a good job. We had dinner, and for the first time, I felt a sense of accomplishment. My sister had gone out on her first date, and my parents told me I could stay up late playing video games. It was a rare reward, and despite my sore hands and exhaustion, I stayed up playing until nearly 1:30 a.m. That's when I first saw it. After shutting off my game, I went to the window and looked outside. I was proud of my work on the shed, but as I stared at it, I saw something. A figure standing next to the shed. At first, I thought it was my dad, but as my eyes adjusted to the dark, I realized it wasn't him. This thing was far too tall, too thin, and its skin was ghostly pale. Its clothes hung in tattered rags, and I could hear a faint tink, tink, tink as its long fingers scraped the side of the shed. Then it looked up at me. Its eyes glowed like an animal caught in headlights. Its face was gaunt, the skin stretched tight over its skull. Its mouth was nothing more than a thin line, but as it stared at me, it twitched, moving unnervingly. "Awake too, Lala late," it whispered, though I could hear it clear as day in my
mind. I was frozen in place as it continued. "Come out to PLPL play, or I come in?"
Its head twisted at an unnatural angle as it slowly started to climb the side of the house, its long, bony fingers digging into the walls like some kind of insect. I finally managed to scream for my parents, but it felt like my voice was caught in my throat. Within moments, the creature was at my second-story window, its pale face pressed against the glass, those horrible eyes locked onto mine. Its thin mouth opened slightly, and I could hear the soft, clicking sound of its teeth snapping together like the shutter of a camera. I bolted for the door, rushing to my parents' room. I shook my dad, screaming at him to wake up, but he didn't stir. It was like they were in a deep, unnatural sleep. My mother, too, no matter how much I shook them, they remained still. And then I heard the front door creak open. My sister had come home. She was trying to sneak in after her curfew, not knowing the horror that awaited her. The creature turned its attention away from me and skittered down the hallway like a spider. I heard my sister scream, a blood-curdling sound that I can still hear in my nightmares. By the time I reached the stairs, the creature had already wrapped its skeletal fingers around her throat, cutting off her scream. Her eyes were wide with terror as her life force was drained from her in a way that I still can't fully explain. It was like her very soul was being sucked out, leaving her hair white and her skin ashen. I tried to stop it, I really did, but I was flung aside, crashing into the wall, my leg breaking on impact. I could only watch in helpless agony as my sister's lifeless body collapsed onto the floor, the creature slithering out the front door as quickly as it had appeared. My life was never the same after that night. The police wrote it off as a home invasion gone wrong, saying my sister had died of a heart attack brought on by fear. But I know the truth. I saw that thing drain the life out of her. Years went by, and I did my best to forget. But a few nights ago it came back. I saw it again, standing by the shed I had built all those years ago, its glowing eyes fixed on me. And now I know it's only a matter of time before it returns for me. Dr. Moss leaned back into his bed, his face a mixture of exhaustion and reverence. His hands trembled slightly as he continued. I had to know more. I was driven by curiosity, but also a creeping sense of dread. Something didn't feel right, even back then. Professor Willow was either a genius beyond my comprehension or a dangerous fool, tampering with forces he didn't fully understand. I asked Kamer for more details, but he deflected, insisting that all would be revealed in time. Dr. Moss stopped, taking a deep breath as if gathering strength to go on. His eyes, once bright with intellect, now seemed hollow. Kamer came to visit a few more times, always with more grandiose tales of Professor Willow's breakthroughs. But after a while the letters stopped. It was like he vanished off the face of the earth.
No one in our circles knew what had become of him, and all my inquiries led to dead ends. I sat forward in my chair, hanging on every word. So, what happened to Willow and that thing in the crate this morning? What was it? Dr. Moss
Looked straight at me, his voice lowering to almost a whisper. Willow's work was not with plants alone. He had taken genetic engineering to realms that should never have been crossed. What you saw in that crate was one of his creations, a mixture of human and other things. He believed he was accelerating evolution, pushing life to its extremes. But what he created was an abomination, and Kamer had become obsessed with it. I felt a shiver down my spine as the reality of the situation began to settle in. But why did you get involved? Why bring it to the Institute? I never wanted it here, Dr. Moss replied, his voice strained. Kamer sent it to me out of desperation. He must have realized too late that Willow had gone too far. That creature, what you saw, it wasn't meant to survive, but somehow it did. And when I saw that crate this morning, I knew it had to be destroyed. Silence fell between us as I processed his words. The room felt heavy, suffocating. The nurses' earlier warnings about not getting him too worked up now made sense. Dr. Moss looked like he was on the edge of collapse, but I still had one final question burning in my mind. Dr. Moss, is Willow still out there? He closed his eyes, a pained expression crossing his face. I don't know, but if he is, then God help us all. The weight of his words hung in the air, suffocating any further conversation. I left the hospital room, my mind racing with fear and questions. The world outside felt colder, more sinister, as if something terrible had been set in motion that couldn't be stopped. As I stepped into the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The nurse tells me I can see him, but cautions me not to get him too worked up. After all, he is recovering from a heart attack. It's past midnight, and I haven't eaten a single thing all day except for 6 cups of coffee. Everything feels like a blur, my memories drifting between reality and dream. I know I must look disheveled, far from composed. The nurse hesitates before eventually taking me across the hall. There's an empty bed in the room, and then I see him, Dr. Moss. The man who once carried an air of regal authority, always calm and composed no matter what crisis hit the research institute. Even during staff picnics, when he traded his bow tie for an apron at the grill, he was a figure of dignity. But now, frail and pale, he looks like a soldier who's lost the war. Still, he smiles as he recognizes me, and for a brief moment there's a hint of my old mentor in his greeting. Yet I know why I'm here. The morning's events loom over us like a dark cloud. I ask him about the crate that was delivered to the facility earlier in the day, the crate that contained a monstrous thing we barely destroyed. I ask how he knew what was inside it. His response takes a long time. "Did you destroy the specimen?" he asks, his voice tired and hoarse. "Yes, just like you asked. Incinerated it." Dr. Moss lets out a long, heavy sigh. His eyes drift toward the window, searching for something in the glow of the street lamps that he'll never find. He begins to speak slowly, recounting a story from years ago. He tells me about a man named Nursultan Kamer, whom he met at a symposium in Prague in the late 90s. They had become friends, exchanging long, detailed letters about their research. But the real story, he explains, began when Kamer met Professor Henry Willow. When Dr. Moss utters the name Professor Henry Willow, there's venom in his voice. He recounts how Kamer wrote about Willow with an almost religious fervor, describing him as a man who could eradicate hunger and manipulate life itself. Moss invited the two to visit his research facility, curious yet skeptical of Willow's supposed breakthroughs. The nurse reappears, breaking the tension. Dr. Moss waves her away, and I can't help but notice the suspicion in her eyes as she leaves. Once the door clicks shut, Dr. Moss continues. He describes a dinner they had, him, Kamer, and Willow. Willow barely spoke, constantly scribbling in a childish notebook covered in Pokemon characters. Moss doubted the man's brilliance until, at Kamer's urging, Willow gave a demonstration. With a pinch of strange yellow sand, Willow made a pot of basil sprout grass so fast that it choked the basil to death within seconds. Moss had been stunned, unable to explain what he saw. But it wasn't the rapid growth that disturbed him the most, it was what came after. Later that evening, back at the research facility, Willow took a handful of the same strange sand and tossed it into an empty garden plot. Within moments, the grass grew so tall that it nearly brushed the roof. As the grass swayed in the wind, something more chilling happened. A sound emerged, a low, murmuring voice, like something trying to speak through human lips. Moss's voice shakes as he recalls that moment. The sound still haunts him, even more so after what we saw earlier today. He describes how, out of the grass, a grotesque creature crawled, its skin covered in insect-like eyes and strange flowers, its lips bloated and babbling nonsense. The creature had died moments after emerging, but the image was burned into Moss's mind. Willow, however, was unfazed. Kamer, ever the optimist, was convinced they were on the brink of a scientific breakthrough. But Moss saw something far darker, an abomination. He threw them out of the facility and destroyed any evidence of the night's events, covering the garden plot with cement. For years, Moss tried to forget, but his nightmares were reignited when the crate arrived this morning. The thing that crawled out of it was not the first monstrosity Willow had created, and Moss feared it wouldn't be the last. As I listened to his story, I realized this isn't just about science gone wrong. There's a deep, foreboding fear lingering in the air, one that won't be easily erased by the destruction of a single specimen. Dr. Moss looks at me, his eyes heavy with regret. "I'm sorry," he whispers, his voice barely audible. "I didn't mean for you to be involved." I tell him it's okay, that we'll figure it out. But deep down, I know this isn't over. I've always been a night owl. The last subway ride home, with its solitude and rhythmic clacking, has always felt like the perfect way to end the day. But after what happened last night, I'm not sure I'll ever step onto a subway again. It started like any other Thursday night. I had stayed late at the office, tied up with a project that had been hanging over me for weeks. The streets were unusually quiet as I made my way to the station, the kind of silence that feels almost unnatural in a city that's always bustling. I hurried down the lone escalator, heading into the underground. It wasn't strange for the last ride of the night to be nearly empty. Most people were home by now. The ride down the long escalator was soothing as usual, and my headphones kept me company, drowning out the city's late-night hush. The station I entered was one of the newer ones, clean and modern, a sharp contrast to the emptiness around me. It felt odd being alone in such a public space, but not unusual for this time of night. The train pulled up, its doors sliding open with their usual whoosh. I stepped inside the familiar empty carriage, settling into my seat. The train started moving, and I leaned against the window, watching the tunnel lights flicker past. The soft rocking lulled me, and I drifted off to sleep. When I woke up, something was off. The train was still moving, but the digital display above the door showed nothing but a blank line. Next station. And the clock read 01:45, but I should have reached my stop 10 minutes ago. Confused, I tried to shake off the drowsiness, but the tunnel outside was different, completely dark. Not even the faint lights that usually illuminated the way were visible. Worse, I was alone. Every car I checked was empty, not a single soul in sight. Panic set in. I approached the intercom to speak to the conductor, but all I got was static. My phone had no signal either, even though the underground system had been equipped with cell service for years. The train just kept moving, as if it had no destination. Frustration turned to fear. I walked through all 7 cars, hoping to find some sign of life, but each was as deserted as the last. Desperation creeping in, I pulled the emergency brake. Nothing. It was as if the train was under someone else's control, someone or something. The minutes ticked by, or so I thought, but when I looked at my watch, it still read 01:45. It was as if time itself had stopped. I tried to distract myself, counting seats, rereading the safety instructions, anything to keep my mind from spiraling. But nothing changed. The darkness outside remained, and the train never slowed down. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself that there must be some technical malfunction, but deep down I knew that no malfunction could explain this endless ride. Hours seemed to pass, though the clock never moved. Exhaustion began to set in. My body was shaking with fear, hunger gnawing at my stomach, but I refused to give in to the rising panic. Desperate for answers, I returned to the conductor's cabin, banging on the door, pleading for help. There was no response, only the oppressive silence of the empty train. Then, just as suddenly as the nightmare had begun, the train began to slow down. My heart raced with hope. I pressed my face against the window, squinting into the darkness, and saw a faint glow ahead. The train came to a stop. The doors opened with a dull clang, and the intercom crackled to life. "End station, please disembark." I stumbled out onto the platform, shaking from fear and exhaustion. The station was just as deserted as the train had been. I didn't stop to catch my breath. I sprinted up the escalator, 3 steps at a time, desperate to escape the oppressive
underground. Finally, I burst out onto the street, gasping for the cool night air. The city outside seemed unchanged, quiet and normal.
My watch now read 01:55. Somehow, despite the hours that had seemed to drag on forever, only 10 minutes had passed. I made it home, collapsing onto my couch, too drained to even think. Since then, I haven't set foot in a subway. I've been taking buses, taxis, anything but that cursed train. No one would believe me if I told them, so I'm writing this as a confession, a way to make sense of it all. I don't expect anyone to take this seriously, but maybe, just maybe, my story will serve as a warning to anyone else who finds themselves alone on a subway late at night. Not every train ride has a destination. Some, it seems, just never stop. Let me start by saying I really don't want to be writing this, but I feel that it is necessary for my safety to figure out what's going on. Last week, my friend Daniel, not his real name, and I, John, again, not my real name, decided we were going to try hiding out overnight in the nearby furniture store. In retrospect, it sounds dumb, but we'd seen videos of people doing this on YouTube. We had just gotten out of university for the summer and didn't have enough money to do anything more exciting. The furniture store was huge. Think of an IKEA if you've ever been to one. It was the size of a warehouse and had 3 stories. Our plan was simple: stow away under a bed or something until all the employees had left, then just mess around until morning. The store closed at 8 p.m, so we got there at 6 p.m, giving us plenty of time to find hiding places while there were still enough customers that we wouldn't attract attention from the staff. We went up to the 3rd floor, where there were mostly displays showing furniture arranged in fake rooms. There were all sorts of setups, but in the center of the displays was a dining room with 4 chairs. 3 of the chairs had plastic plates with cartoon characters, and only one had a normal place setting. Daniel and I gave each other a quick glance before racing to sit in the adult chair before the other. Daniel, being a track runner, beat me to it. "Sit down, Sonny," Daniel said with a grin, sitting in the adult chair. "Oh, ha ha ha," I replied. "This probably isn't even a kid's chair. They likely just replaced the plates with plastic ones, as the ceramic ones broke. You know, there's only 1 parent and 3 children." "Stop complaining, son," Daniel said in a deep voice, mimicking an annoyed father. We both laughed, got up, and continued walking around until it was about 7 p.m. We figured it was time to find hiding spots. Daniel found a kids' room display with a race car bed. "Hell yeah," he yelled out, much too loud for a 20-year-old. "Cover me while I hide." He bent down, pretending to look at the price tag, while I pretended to take pictures. Once he was hidden under the bed, I began searching for a place of my own. After some looking, I decided hiding under a bed was my best option. I chose a king-size bed that had a good view of the dining room in the center and, further away, the race car bed where Daniel was hiding. We texted back and forth, playing rock, paper, scissors until I got bored. I decided to turn the brightness down on my phone and doom scroll until the store emptied out. Suddenly I was startled by a sharp screech echoing through the air. I glanced at my phone. It was exactly 8 p.m. I thought it was strange that a store alarm would go off at closing time, but then it got even weirder. All the staff began ushering the remaining customers out of the store with an urgency I had never seen before. Daniel and I exchanged frantic texts, but we reassured ourselves that it was probably some policy to make sure no employees stayed over time. By 8:05 p.m., the third floor was dead silent, and from what I could see, no one was left. I texted Daniel one last time, telling him we should wait until the lights went out before coming out of our hiding spots. Then my phone died, thanks to my TikTok addiction. I waited in the dark for what felt like 10 to 15 minutes, trying to relax. That's when the metal double doors that led to the storage room burst open, and a dozen women dressed in formal attire marched out in a single file line. They were all carrying different objects: a bottle of water, a bottle of wine, a basket with napkins and silverware, a candle, a metal figurine of some sort, a covered platter, 3 folded blankets, 1 green, 1 red, 1 blue, and 3 3-foot-tall dolls. I stared in disbelief as the women set the table meticulously. The metal figurine was placed in front of the adult chair, and the dolls, 1 with red hair, 1 blonde, and 1 brown-haired, were seated in the children's chairs. Then 3 women with blankets began moving toward the outer parts of the showroom. One with the green blanket went to the kids' room display on my left, another with the red blanket moved to a display on my right, and the one with the blue blanket headed directly toward the race car bed where Daniel was hiding. My heart raced. She placed the blue blanket over the race car bed, and I caught Daniel's eyes. His face had gone pale. The women retreated back through the double doors as orderly as they had come, leaving the eerie scene behind. Daniel and I exchanged looks, utterly bewildered. What was this? A late-night display setup. And what were the dolls for? Before we could make sense of it, a man dressed in a dark red suit emerged from the same doors. He walked over to the remaining chair, placed his hand on it and spoke coldly. "Hello, children." The way he said it sent shivers down my spine. I instinctively reached for my phone to record, but I remembered it was dead. I waved my hand toward Daniel, signaling him to record with his phone. He nodded and began filming. Meanwhile, the man sat down at the table and started pouring water for the dolls. He spoke softly to them as if they were real children. It was unsettling. I pressed myself against the headboard, trying to distance myself from the scene. From where I was, I could no longer see the table, but I could hear the man talking in a low, creepy tone. I stayed there, curled up against the wall for what felt like an hour. Then a lone chair squeaked as it was pushed back. The man stood and said, "Time for bed, my lovelies," in a soft but chilling voice. He picked up the blonde-haired doll and began walking toward the race car bed, toward Daniel. I watched in horror as he laid the doll down on the bed, covering her.
"It with the blanket." "I love you," the man whispered, giving the doll a sickening kiss on the cheek. Daniel, visibly shaking, grabbed his phone and crawled out from under the bed as soon as the man turned away.
He sprinted toward the stairs, giving me a quick glance filled with fear and regret. The man, noticing Daniel's escape, froze and stared at him with pure hatred. Without a word, 2 of the women from earlier appeared, one carrying a revolver and the other a shotgun. They offered the weapons to the man. He took the revolver and fired a single shot at Daniel. The bullet missed, and Daniel disappeared down the stairs. The man handed the gun back to the woman and the women disappeared into the storage room again. The man continued tucking in the dolls as if nothing had happened, whispering, "I love you," to each of them. Then he turned, picked up the metal figurine, and began walking toward the doors. But just as he was about to leave, he stopped. "It's rude to stare, you know," he said, loudly, his voice echoing across the empty floor. My heart dropped. How had he seen me? I knew I had to run. I crawled out from under the bed and bolted.
Toward the stairs as fast as I could. "I think I'll be seeing you for dinner soon," he called after me.
"And your friend as well." I ran down the stairs, out the front doors, and didn't stop until I was far from the store. I wasn't familiar with the area, but I eventually found my way to a nearby mall. I spent the rest of the night in the CRYPTID food court, charging my phone. As soon as I had a bit of battery, I called Daniel, but he didn't answer. I texted him and tried messaging him on social media, but it looked like he had deleted all of his accounts. I thought maybe he was just embarrassed until this morning when I woke up to a message from an unknown number. There was no text, just 2 emojis, a fork and a plate. I don't feel safe anymore. They have my number. Either they've gotten to Daniel or they know who I am, both terrifying possibilities. I could go to the police, but without the video. Daniel took my story would sound insane. Has anyone ever heard of a cult like this? Any advice would be greatly appreciated. I'm starting this off with a story that shows how housekeepers can be pretty great house guests if treated right, of course. First, if you're unfamiliar with what Orion Pest Control does, you might want to start with some background, but I'll dive right in here. This case started out like many others. The client called us, didn't take our advice seriously, and then got shocked when their actions led to some weird consequences. Luckily, this client figured things out fast enough before the situation got worse, before the housekeeper transformed. Quick side note, I really don't understand why some people have such a hard time treating their housekeepers with basic decency. These suburban folks act all posh, but when it comes to something as simple as offering a bowl of cream to what's basically a mystical maid, they get all stubborn. Anyway, things got a little crazy when the housekeeper somehow ended up inside. The walls. The call for help as. Soon as I stepped into the house, I could hear the muffled grumbling of the housekeeper. The homeowner sat nervously in the living room, tapping his foot while scratching noises echoed from above. I wasn't sure if the housekeeper had fully transformed yet, but since it hadn't attacked the client, there was still hope we could reason with it. The guy sheepishly admitted that things had been fine with the housekeeper until that morning, when it got itself stuck in the walls. He had no idea how it even happened. I sighed and gave him the plan. "All right, I'm going to try to get it out without getting either of us killed. You should find somewhere safe to hang out, and I'll probably need to call someone to back me up." He nodded, muttered something about calling him when it was safe, and left quickly. I called Victor to help out while glassware rattled around me. The housekeeper let out an ear-piercing screech, signaling it was not happy. Victor's first question was blunt. "How the hell did it get in the walls?" "I have no idea," I said, rubbing my temples. "I'll check things out, maybe find an entry point." "Don't engage until I get there," Victor warned. "It's probably more aggressive being stuck like that." I agreed and grabbed the toolbox from the truck. My first thought was the attic. It's possible it found a hole and just fell in. Housekeepers don't burrow. They prefer living in comfy, civilized spaces. So I knew it was probably as mad about this situation as the homeowner was. Finding the housekeeper in the attic, I found a hole in the insulation. Maybe rodents were involved, but something odd caught my eye. Grey feathers scattered around.
Birds, maybe? Then I heard the housekeeper swearing loudly, followed by more scratching. "Everything all right in there?" I called out, trying to sound friendly.
"Yeah, just peachy," it yelled sarcastically. "I love being stuck in here." At least it was still talking, which meant it hadn't transformed yet. That was a good sign. "Look, I didn't mean to patronize you. Could you knock on the wall so I can figure out the best way to get you out of there?" I asked, staying calm. After some grumbling, it knocked. I followed the sound and located the room where the knocks were loudest. Pressing my ear to the wall, I called out, "How much space do you have in there?" "About 2 feet on either side," it replied gruffly. "Okay, I've got some cables in the truck. I'll lower one down to you and pull you out." The housekeeper sounded dubious. "You're gonna fish me out?" "It's worth a try." "Stay put," I replied, realizing how dumb that sounded the moment it left my mouth. "Where else am I gonna go? Take a stroll under the floorboards?" It snarked. The rescue eye grabbed the cable from the truck and returned to the attic. I wasn't sure if it would be long enough to reach the housekeeper, but busting a hole in the client's wall was the last thing I wanted to do. It'd take more time and cost them extra for repairs. I got into position and slowly lowered the cable. "A bit to the right," it shouted. "No, my right, your left." After a few minutes, I felt a weight on the other end. "You ready?" I asked. "Yeah, pull me up." I started hauling the housekeeper up. They're surprisingly light, must be mostly fur
Or something. Finally, I saw 2 small, hairy hands grasp the opening. Being careful, I grabbed its wrists and pulled. Right then, Victor walked in, just as the housekeeper slipped. I caught it mid-air and suddenly found myself holding it like a child on my hip. None of us were happy about it, especially the housekeeper. I parked the Jeep and shut off the engine, the eerie silence of the surroundings immediately pressing in on us. The air felt heavy, like the land itself was warning us to turn back. Iolo stared out at the entrance, his face unreadable.
"You sure we have to do this tonight?" I asked, unable to shake the sense of impending doom. Iolo didn't even look at me, his voice cool and detached. "Those worms won't wait. If we don't handle this now, it'll be too late." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "All right, let's get this over with." We both exited the Jeep, the crunch of gravel under our feet sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. I reached for my gear in the back, a satchel of salt, a flashlight, and my hagstone still safely around my neck. Iolo, however, didn't seem to need much. He carried a strange old lantern, dimly glowing with a soft, unnatural light. Its eerie, flickering flame cast long, distorted shadows across the rocky terrain. As we approached the mine's entrance, Iolo glanced over at me. "Remember, pup, stay close and keep that salt handy. Once we're inside, things are going to get unpleasant." I nodded, gripping the satchel tightly as we stepped into the darkness. The cold immediately wrapped around me like a shroud, the air inside the mine musty and stale. It felt like stepping into a tomb. The mine was old, long abandoned, with wooden beams creaking ominously above our heads. Dust particles floated lazily in the dim light of Iolo's lantern. The deeper we went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. I could hear distant scurrying, whether it was the worms or something.
"Else I couldn't tell. What's the plan?"
I asked in a whisper, my voice sounding too loud in the cramped space. Iolo glanced over his shoulder, his expression serious. "We find the nest, the queen. She's the one laying the eggs. Once we salt her, the rest will die off." "Great," I muttered. Sounds simple enough, but I knew it wouldn't be. Nothing ever was when it came to these creatures. The last time I'd encountered the worms, I barely made it out alive, and the thought of facing their queen made my skin crawl. As we ventured deeper, the air grew colder, and the walls seemed to close in on us. The mine's structure was fragile, and the weight of the mountain above us pressed down, a constant reminder that we were far from safety. The ground beneath my feet felt softer, almost damp. Something slithered past my boot, and I jumped, but Iolo didn't even flinch. Suddenly the tunnel opened into a larger cavern. It was pitch black, save for the faint glow of Iolo's lantern. The walls were slick with moisture, and the air smelled of decay. In the center of the cavern, I could just make out a writhing mass. Dozens, maybe hundreds of the worms, coiled and twisted together like some nightmarish tapestry. Iolo stepped forward, holding the lantern high. "There," he said quietly, nodding toward the far side of the cavern. And then I saw her, the queen. She was massive, her bloated, translucent body pulsating with movement as smaller worms crawled in and out of her flesh. Her eyes, dark, lifeless, seemed to stare right through me, and her mouth, if you could call it that, was lined, with jagged teeth gnashing as she fed on the air around her. I gagged, feeling bile rise in my throat. How do we get close enough to salt her? Iolo gave me a sharp look. Carefully. He moved first, stepping closer to the queen, his lantern casting grotesque shadows on the walls. The worms reacted to his presence, their movements becoming agitated. I followed, every instinct in my body screaming at me to turn and run. We were almost within striking distance when the queen let out a deafening shriek, her body convulsing as if she sensed the danger. The smaller worms began to swarm, slithering
toward us with unnatural speed. "Now!" Iolo barked, tossing a handful of salt into the air. I fumbled with my satchel, but managed to fling the salt toward the queen.
The reaction was immediate. The worms writhed in agony as the salt touched their skin, their flesh sizzling and melting away. The queen let out another ear-splitting scream, her body thrashing violently. But it wasn't over yet. As the salt took effect, the cavern began to shake, the wooden supports groaning under the strain. Rocks tumbled from the ceiling, and Iolo grabbed my arm, pulling me back toward the entrance. "We have to get out of here," he shouted over the noise. I didn't
argue. We sprinted toward the tunnel, the ground shaking beneath our feet.
Behind us, the queen let out one final monstrous wail before the cavern collapsed in on itself, sealing her and the remaining worms inside. We barely made it out in time. The mine entrance crumbled behind us, sending a cloud of dust and debris into the night air. I coughed, wiping the grime from my face as I stumbled away from the wreckage. Iolo stood beside me, surprisingly calm despite the chaos we'd just escaped. He glanced at the mine, then at me. "Well, that was fun."
"Fun?" I wheezed. "That was a nightmare." He grinned, clearly enjoying my discomfort. "Welcome to my world, pup." I shot him a glare but said nothing, too exhausted to argue. All I wanted was a shower and about 10 hours of sleep.
Iolo started walking back to the jeep. He added, "By the way, your brakes are still shit." I groaned. "I'll get them fixed, all right?" "Good. I'll be seeing you soon then." I wasn't sure if that was a promise or a threat. Either way, I had a feeling this wouldn't be the last time I'd find myself dealing with the worms, or with Iolo. We drove back in silence, the weight of the night still heavy on my shoulders. The mechanic and I proceeded cautiously through the cavern, our footsteps echoing in the damp silence. My nerves were shot, the oppressive weight of the underground pressing against me, and the white stag's lingering presence in my mind didn't help. Even though I tried to shake the memories of the horrific beast, every scrape of my boot on the rock seemed to remind me of the white, slimy fur and those worms. Those worms. I couldn't help but glance at Iolo, who seemed as calm as ever. It was unnerving how he could walk through these situations without breaking a sweat. After everything we had just faced, he didn't seem rattled at all, but me, I felt the need to scratch my skin raw, convinced that there was still something crawling beneath the surface. I kept checking my neck for any sign of movement, of the worm's telltale squirming. So far, nothing. Yet, the fear was enough to drive me mad. The hospital tests had been clear, no parasites. Still, my paranoia wouldn't subside. Every twitch or tingle sent my mind racing back to that moment when I'd felt the worm tear into my neck. And then Iolo, the way he had so casually saved me by sucking the worms out. Who does that? But something had changed between us after that. He had saved me, yes, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he had gained something from it. What did he mean by saying I had a built-in hagstone against him? What new limitations did he have? These questions swirled in my head, making it difficult to sleep, to rest. The white stag's presence in my dreams wasn't helping either. It never did anything in my dreams, just stood there, silently watching, always in the corner of my vision, never moving, but ever present. I couldn't tell whether it was some sort of warning or a residual effect of the worm's parasitic influence. One night, however, the dream was different. I was standing in the middle of the forest, surrounded by the same familiar trees from my childhood. There was an eerie calm in the air, no wind, no sound, just a thick, overwhelming stillness. And there, standing at the edge of the clearing, was the white stag. Its antlers were sharper than I remembered, more jagged. The slime on its fur seemed to glow faintly under the moonlight. It didn't move toward me. It just watched. I tried to walk away, but my legs felt heavy, as if the ground was trying to pull me down. The air around me thickened, pressing against my skin, and I began to panic.
I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything to get away from that thing, but I couldn't. I was frozen, trapped in the white stag's gaze. And then, just like that, I woke up. But even awake, I could still feel the weight of its eyes on me. After
days of restless sleep and constant anxiety, I started seeing the stag in my waking life too. I'd be driving down a familiar road, and out of the corner of my eye I'd see a flash of white fur in the woods, or I'd glance at the window late at night and swear I saw the gleam of those jagged antlers in the darkness. But every time I turned to look, there was nothing there. I started to wonder if the bite had left more than just a physical mark on me. Maybe those worms had done something to my mind. Or maybe I had spent too much time with Iolo, and whatever darkness surrounded him was starting to seep into me too. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed answers, and I knew there was only one person who could give them to me. I grabbed my keys and headed back to where I knew I'd find him, out in the woods, where the white stag had first appeared. Iolo
was there as I expected, sitting on a rock, plucking at his banjo.
The same smug grin spread across his face as I approached. "Took you long enough," he said, without looking up. "I need to know what's going on with me," I demanded, my voice shaking with frustration. He finally looked up, his eyes gleaming, with that same unsettling confidence. "Still seeing the stag, are you?" I nodded, my heart racing. "It's in my dreams, and I see it. During the day sometimes. I can't tell if it's real, or if it's just in my head." Iolo chuckled, darkly, plucking another string on his banjo.
That's what happens when you're marked by something like that. The white stag ain't just a creature, it's a symbol. It's part of something much bigger than you or me. I stared at him, trying to wrap my head around what he was saying. So, what does that mean for me? Am I infected? Nah, he said with a casual wave of his hand. You're clean, at least physically. But you've been touched by something ancient, something that don't let go so easily. That stag. It's got its eye on you now, I swallowed, hard, the weight of his words sinking in. So, what do I do? Iolo stood up, slinging the banjo over his shoulder. You've got two choices. You can run, try to live your life like nothing ever happened.
But that stag will always be there, in the corner of your mind, watching, waiting. Or you face it head on. You go back to where it all started and confront it. My stomach churned at the thought of going back to that mine, to the place where the white stag had first appeared. But deep down, I knew I didn't have a choice. If I didn't face it now, it would haunt me for the rest of my life. I looked at Iolo, his eyes gleaming with something that looked like approval. How do I do that? His smile widened. Oh, I think you'll figure that out when the time comes. Just be ready, pup. The white stag ain't done with you yet. As I turned to leave, I couldn't help but feel like I was stepping into a
nightmare I'd never wake up from. The white stag was out there, waiting for me, and sooner or later I'd have to face it. But this time, I wouldn't be running. This time, I'd be ready, or at least, I hoped I would be.